we know from the literature that as long as you're close to failure, you're going to make similar muscle gains. So, but there is some evidence indicating that there may be something to varying your rep ranges, and you varying your rep ranges is not going to cost you more time, allows for more flexibility, and being fixed to one rep range doesn't, like, it's not giving you anything more, you know? However, I'm personally a big fan, and now we're not talking about the strength athlete strictly anymore, but like in general for hypertrophy work, I think staying within 5 to 12 reps is good, because if we look back at how good are people at gauging how close to failure there are data, things started looking a bit off after 12 reps.
It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. All right, guys, we're back with another episode of Table Talk. Today, our guest is Dr. Pak. Dr. Pak there's a lot of accolades here, so I'm just going to rip through some and let you fill in the blanks. You know, exercise scientist, educator, coach. You did your PhD in minimum effective training and powerlifting. Currently at Lehman College, is that right?
As an associate, not
as
associate. As a, what's it called? Visiting scholar.
Yes, and researcher, and also works with a coach of athletes of various backgrounds.
100%.
Did I forget anything?
No. A bald Greek, ginger beard.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's obvious, though.
I
mean, that's very, very simple to be able to see there. Well, I don't want to go a lot into your origin story, but I do think it's important for people to kind of know, you know, how you got here from, I think you started training when you were 16. Mm-hmm. So how you got to where you are now, and why this direction instead of going down some other scientific route, which may compensate way more than what studying eccentrics in a lengthened position does.
Yeah, for sure. So thank you so much for having me. Huge honor, follower of elitefts since a very young age. And long story short, I got into lifting when I was 16, got into strength training, got into powerlifting, went to study sports science. And then when it came time for my PhD, we were training back in Greece. So I live in the UK, but whenever I would go back to Greece, we had access to the Olympic weightlifting hall, the classic one where a lot of like big Olympic.
What time would this have been?
2016, 2017. And essentially there was a group of us who started a powerlifting team that was led by a coach at the time, and we thought to do a study on low volume training for powerlifting, as low as like one single a week, and that essentially inspired my PhD on what's the least a powerlifter needs to do in order to get stronger. And then from that, although I love powerlifting, I don't identify as a powerlifter. I just like lifting and I like training for strength and muscle mass, and I fell in love with the research, and that's why I'm here now.
How did the minimum dose come? Because I'm kind of going through my weightlifting history really, really fast in my brain, where weightlifting is not typically low volume or minimum effective dose.
Yeah.
Right. It's usually on the higher end of all that. Was the Olympic weightlifting at that time on the higher end of volume per se?
So I probably confused you a bit. It was at an Olympic weightlifting hall, and we had a powerlifting team within that hall.
I get it. That was my bad. Yeah, but why the minimum effective?
So we were sitting there with a coach, and we were like, look, this is a very rare chance of having a bunch of powerlifters in a room where, I mean, powerlifting in Greece is nothing like it is here. And because they were getting trained for free, it was a good chance to be like, okay, let's do a short, ecologically valid real world study and test out something a bit more extreme. So we were like, let's do a traditional sort of prep program, training cycle before their competition versus a super low volume training program and see whether there's anything there. So we did that, and off the back of that study, I got the idea of, okay, let's now look at the rest of the literature. What is there in the literature as far as powerlifting and volume goes? Oh, nothing? Okay, strange. Let's do a PhD on what's the least a powerlifter needs to do in order to get meaningfully stronger, which was part of the project as well, defining that meaningfulness.
So in the literature, how is volume defined?
So usually, I mean, back in the day would be tonnage. People would refer to sets times reps times load.
Yeah.
So now it's a more appropriate way is to look at it as hard sets performed. But that will depend on strength or hypertrophy, because for strength, even a set far away from failure can still be productive. So you would just count working sets essentially.
So in your study, how was it defined?
It was, so we had one group of people that was doing one single per week for the deadlift at RP 9 to 9.5. They did 2 singles a week for the squat and 3 singles a week for the bench.
All right, so it was defined by workload and kind of...
Yeah.
So I would call volume sets times reps.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I was always taught that. And then workload would be sets times reps times weight.
Yeah.
Workload. And so both were being covered.
Yeah.
Because I've heard things like this before. Well, they'll say it's lower volume, but it may be 5 singles at 90% being compared to the higher volume, which would be, 90, basically can be the exact same thing.
Yeah. But the thing is, we did that sort of pilot study to see, okay, is there anything there? Could people get away with just 1 single a week on some lifts? And we did the study in the most real world scenario possible, because we had people essentially, as part of the study, they prepared for Greek nationals. So their testing was at nationals, which was both a strength and a limitation. But we saw that many of them mid 10-week training cycle saw solid strength gains across the board. And then that inspired the following 2 training studies where we compared only low volume training programs, extremely low volume and low-ish volume. But also because we wanted to G-check ourselves and be like, okay, sure, we got a bunch of powerlifters that did super low volume training. They got what they got. One, how do we know if the strength increases they saw are meaningful? So we went ahead and asked hundreds of coaches and athletes, powerlifting coaches and athletes. And then, because I'm a big believer, especially in a limited area of the literature like powerlifting, I'm a big believer in asking actual experts, so people in the field like you. Okay, guys, what's your experience with the minimum effective dose? So we interviewed elite powerlifters, and I'm talking like some all-time world record holders that are still standing, multiple IPF, can I say IPF? Multiple, I did the joke. Semi-ladder. Like multiple world champions and coaches that had worked with thousands of like gold medalists and world record holders, and essentially then triangulated all that data to arrive to a conclusion versus just going, okay, we got a bunch of lifters for 6 weeks. This is what how their strength went. It was statistically significant, therefore yada yada yada. We didn't do that. We asked the coaches and athletes, what do you think is a meaningful increase in 6 weeks in strength? And then we essentially looked at the probability of those different protocols landing those lifters either within what's considered meaningful in practice or going above that. And also obviously looked at what the coaches and athletes said.
How did you control for the heavier warm-up sets?
That was going to be my question.
Yeah. So say if it's 93% for a triple, based upon how strong there are, some people may have, 75%, 78%, 82%, 88%, 90%, which in a way could make that higher volume.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's one of the things that I would change if I could go back, because we instructed everybody to, the protocols were either 1 single rep at RP 9 to 9.5, so near max rep, or a single, the exact same single, followed by 2 sets of 3 at 80% of whatever they hit for that single. But as you both clearly said, and I totally agree, it would have been really cool if we had also documented their warm-ups, because those extra couple of singles, 3 singles, whatever, at 70, 80, 85% of 1 RM, those would still count, in my opinion, as a working set. But we didn't. We just looked at the top set.
But in that scenario, at least if they're both working up to that top single, they're both doing similar warm-ups.
Yes.
But then the volume, the extra volume is coming in the down sets.
Yeah, for the one group.
The one group.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's really shouldn't make any significant difference, in how they're warming up.
No, I mean, it'd be different if one set's doing like a single at 95 and the others people are doing 5x5 at 80% because they don't have to warm up as much to 80% as they do to.
So what were the conclusions?
So the the people that were doing just the singles, they had like a 13% chance or so to experience strength gains that are considered meaningful by coaches and athletes as far as total. The group that did the backoffs had a 99% chance of exceeding what was considered meaningful. Now, in raw numbers, they added about 50-ish pounds to their total in 6 weeks. And they were trained powerlifters. For the literature, I think they were the strongest sort of sample of lifters in the current literature in a training study. We're talking maybe like 80 kilos, 80 to 90 kilos, 500 to 600 total. Nothing that will get you to lose your mind, but like for the literature, it was solid. And the conclusion when we triangulated with the data from the interviews, because obviously if coaches and athletes said, you know what, you need at least 10 sets per week, and then that went against what the studies found, then that's something to take in consideration. But they all aligned pretty much. So around 3 to 6 sets per lift per week at around 1 to 5 reps with loads above 80-85% of 1RM are enough for a powerlifter to see meaningful strength increases for periods of 6 to 12 weeks.
Now you say per week, was it also controlled in just one session or multiple sessions for those sets per week?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So it was 3 to 6 sets performed 2 to 3 times per week, but obviously not 2 times per week times 3 sets, but a total of 3 to 6 sets spread out over 2 to 3 weeks,
which ends up being 1 or 2 working sets.
Yeah,
per. Okay.
In that pilot study, were they doing any work at all outside of that single? So no like blood flow work or anything like that. It was literally going work up to that single. So it was as low volume as humanly possible.
Yeah, that was the same for both the pilot and the other 2 training studies. No accessories, nothing else.
In those studies, what type of and you may not be able to answer this depending on how well you know the participants, but what type of training plan were they coming off the back of? So you imagine some guy has run some really high volume training program. You put him in the low volume group versus someone who's come off a low volume program goes into the low volume group. There's probably going to be a differing reaction, you'd imagine there, right?
100%. And that's a really, really good point, because that's a potential limitation of those studies. Because like it's important to differentiate between current 1 repetition maximum strength and all-time PR or all-time peak 1RM strength, because it could have been that, as you said, you come off a high volume program, you're doing 6 weeks of singles or 10 weeks as they did in the pilot study, you essentially peak, you're only doing like 3 sets a week, fatigue is low, you're as specific as it gets, and you see a ton of increase from like point A to point B, but without actually hitting an all-time PR. But what we required participants is for them to not have any experience with such low volume singles based training for a few weeks close to the study.
So in your perfect world, sorry to interrupt, would you have that group, would you inherit them early and ideally run a specific training program before doing the experiment protocol to make sure they're on the same page? Do you get what I'm saying? Or do you think that wouldn't have application? Yeah,
like in an ideal scenario, the studies would have been longer. I would have been able to have the lifters there for like 2-3 months. 3+ months actually. Measure hypertrophy as well. I'd be super interested in seeing, like, did they actually manage to maintain or even increase muscle mass with like a single per week? And I would definitely have also some sort of like a 4-week phase before where they essentially do that training so they're not sensitive to it, if that makes sense. But that's where, again, I'm able to lean on what the athletes and coaches said, because that matched with what we saw. And based on the overall volume, overall literature on training volume, and there was a very recent meta-analysis that came out, pre-printed a few weeks ago, that was the most comprehensive and up-to-date meta. And for strength, it found that minimum effective dose starts at 1 set per week, and results start to plateau at around like 4 sets per week. Keep granted in Gen Pop, not in powerlifters. That's it. So a lot of things that I would do differently, but keep in mind the big limitation that people don't get in our field, and especially when looking at strength sports, because that's been a thing that I really like. We've done other projects on powerlifting specifically and just strength sports in general, is that there's no funding, and it's very, very, very difficult to get powerlifters to commit to training outside of what they want.
Yeah, especially if it's for a meet.
Yeah, especially for the if it's for a meet, but especially if it's a bit unorthodox in nature. If I tell them, okay, you're going to be coached by, maybe they will follow it. But even then, it's difficult to recruit people, because we did a survey as part of the PhD where we asked people if they had experimented with minimum dose training before, and like I think 60% or so said no, and the reason was that they didn't want to potentially miss out on gains. So there's when you're a power lifter, especially a hobby power lifter, you're spending time, money, mental energy, and like to be asked to spend now 3 months of your time potentially risking not making progress, for a lot of people that's a no-go. But hopefully, based on this data, people can feel a bit more comfortable with lower volume training, especially during periods where they're busy or can't recover.
It's kind of interesting to me, because I'm not sure if I can really grasp that they're not comfortable with minimum, effective dose, because isn't that what the peak mesocycle is when they're training for a meet? Because they drop the things down, they're already kind of doing it, which is, with your study, it was 6 weeks again?
Yeah, the one study was 10 and the other 2 were 6.
Okay, so the 10 has more relevance in my brain, because the 6 could just be they're doing their normal higher volume, and then all they do is peak.
Yeah.
And there should be a response just because they're peaking. If they're in close to an overreaching state before that peak actually occurred. The 10 weeks makes that a little more tricky. Right, because most people can't maintain that. But what we see with a lot of lifters is their volume will accidentally decrease. Say they just get busy, or it's around the holidays or whatever it's going to be, and they realize, oh my God, I'm stronger in the gym. But what they don't realize that they're actually doing is they are kind of like peaking the same way they would for a meet. But because it happens outside that window, they fall into this mindset of, oh, I don't need to do all this other stuff.
Yeah.
Then 20 weeks later, they're like, why in the hell is nothing growing?
Exactly.
Because of that. And so at that 10-week, say if the study was a 3-week or a 4-week, I would definitely be sitting here thinking, oh, you just kind of like peaked them for the meet. 6 makes it a little kind of on the edge, where 10, anybody that's going to do that, for an extended period of time, who would start to see a decrease.
Yeah.
Just because other physical, I got to backtrack, where the other physical capacity is being tracked. Because if they're going from higher volume to lower volume, there can be a decrease in that workload, and their work capacity can decrease as well. If for that 10 weeks, for instance, where their controls, say like on accessories or their cardio or just anything to be able to keep their work capacity and their ability to recover optimized.
Yeah, no, we didn't control for their, we asked them to not do any training. So there was no other training happening. Cardio, now I'm not sure if anybody did any actual cardio. We looked at sleep quality and soreness as well. And soreness was minimal as expected. But I think the issue with the 10-week study, which was a pilot study, is that was the super low volume training protocol where they just did the single. Had they done the back of sets as well, as they did in a couple of the groups in the 6-week studies, I think that would be a different story as far as maintaining adaptations goes, as far as maintaining muscle mass. Now, work capacity and overall fitness, probably not, especially if you're used to doing sets on sets on sets, and all of a sudden you're doing a single and 2 back of sets. But from a maintaining muscle mass perspective, I think they'd maintain.
Hypothetically, after that, but just in other research that you've done, would it be better for most, and when I say that, I'm going to talk statistically significant, like 52%, like 51%, to have the work sets in front of the heavy set or the back off sets? Because it could still be, say, 85%. So in other words, if they're going to use 90% for a triple and you want to increase the volume, it could be 80% for a triple, 85% for a triple, 80 or 90% for a triple. And then there's the 9 reps over that 80% range, or get straight up to the 90%, as safely and effectively as you can, and then drop down for the triples?
Ideally, we would look at everything.
Yeah.
But like you have to also not sell it, but make it appealing to the powerlifter. So ideally, we would get 800 powerlifters and be like, okay, we're going to test every sort of variation.
Yeah.
We're going to do, one group will do one single every 2 weeks. Let's see what happens then. The other group will do just singles very far away from failure at like 4 or 5 reps in reserve and then easy backoffs. The other group will do maximal backoffs. We also had one of the groups did an AMRAP at 70% of their 1RM, and that's all they did. They didn't do heavy work at all, and they saw better strength increases than the group that did just the singles. But because of COVID, we had to cut the study short early, so it was only like a handful of people. But yeah, there would be a lot of things that I'd be interested in looking at. Unfortunately, the only way to do that is if you get clubs, like powerlifting clubs, to collaborate and create sort of a collaborative environment where each club is getting some of their lifters to participate in these studies, so you can get a big sample of people. Because these studies are cool in terms of like being able to get an idea of, okay, this is what we saw, but by themselves, without the interview data and in general the expert opinion out there and the totality of the rest of the literature, they can't stand by themselves, in my opinion, because of how small the sample sizes are.
Well, anecdotally, when you were speaking to these lifters, what do you think they tend to favor? More front loading or what I would call back loading?
They enjoyed the back of sets because they worked up to the single and then it was easier work after. Everybody said easy work after, and because I knew many of them personally, some of them saw all-time PRs, so they were pretty happy. But I'd be interested in flipping it as well and seeing if that makes any difference.
Well, I grew up at a time where the inverse was being proponed. Like your body's going to remember the last heavy thing that you do. Like there's like your soul is going to remember what that last heavy weight was. So if it's 600 pounds for a triple, your soul remembers that. So the next time the 620 will be easier. But if you drop down to 455 for some fives, then your soul remembers the 450. I don't know any other way to explain it because it's just like bro science. Like don't ever do it on the way up, because it's too fatiguing, where I would make the argument maybe you're just out of shape, and then on the way down, the issues with that is it's not really 85% anymore because you're already fatigued because you did the other one. So it may be 85%, but at that time period, it may be 5-10% higher. So now you're going to overreach. So you get where I'm going.
Yeah, for sure.
It's this cyclical thing of hell, which comes down to the art of the training. But I love it when they make the definitive statements based upon like your soul being able to recover or whatever the hell it is.
Yeah, I grew up following that era. Obviously, I'm 30 years old, but it was a bit more romantic back in those days. And I think there is something to that. Like, obviously, we haven't studied the psychology side of powerlifting. We haven't studied powerlifting much. Like, keep in mind, the studies of my PhD made up, I think, 70 or 80% of the entire literature on training studies on powerlifters, which is not a flex. It's just that there's not much on powerlifting. But it would be cool to also look at that psychologically speaking, because there are lifters that will say, I need to essentially conquer this weight, and by conquering this weight they mean that I performed it once, peaked or in a good session, but I need to do it multiple times when I'm tired, in different conditions, different bar, whatever, and then I've conquered that weight, and now I feel confident that I can hit that weight.
I think like personality type probably plays into that out, right? Like you've got a naturally anxious lifter, maybe someone with low self-confidence probably is going to like that approach where they've got to hit 90% for a triple, but if they can hit a couple of triples working up to it, it's kind of like boiling a frog, where if you do it slow, it doesn't realize it's going on. So, whereas someone who's maybe all revved, have you not heard that analogy?
You boil frogs?
Yeah, so if you put a frog in cold water and boil it, bring the temperature up slowly, it doesn't realize that it's going to boil alive. Whereas if you throw a frog in boiling water, it jumps out straight away.
Oh, wow.
So it's like bringing that intensity up slowly makes them feel confident. Oh, it's only 10 more pounds or 20 more pounds. Whereas someone maybe who's a bit more of an adrenaline junkie or really more numbers focused probably wants to come in and all they're worried about is that single or that top. Like that's what they define success by. So like I want to be as fresh as humanly possible to hit that because I care about that more and I just want to go in and rip it off the floor floor or whatever. So that would be a cool study, because there's probably arguments for both, right? Like,
yeah, for sure.
You do the heavy one first and you get the post-activation potential. Maybe the drop sets are better. But as you said, there's, in most learning studies, the thing that you do last in a learning session is what you remember the most and what you learn. So there's something to be said, if you do the heaviest thing first, maybe there's a carryover. But then the argument would become, if that last set technically is poor because it's right on the limit, is that the way you want to end the session and learn more from?
Yeah.
You know, if it's a maximal but technically perfect set, great. But how many people do that?
Yeah.
Probably very few.
Before we get in the weeds, let's talk a little bit about just the stigma against science-based and research, right? Well, I think this is important, right? Because you're studying things in isolation, right? And I don't think people really understand that whole concept. You know, now meta-analysis are going to be a little bit different, but yet a study can't control all controllables, you know, such as the psychological aspect, unless it is just that, you know, or the sociological aspect, or a lot of the biological aspects. And so when you get the kickback against the science-based stuff, it's like, well, they don't know shit because they're not working with real lifters, which we already put one thing out there. Real lifters will bitch about that, but yet not participate in the studies, you know, which is a dichotomy in itself there. And then all those other things that come in. So explain to us, you know, what the goal of the research is, right? And then how it can be used outside of clickbaitable stuff to be able to try to get more views because you're reviewing one article or whatever it is, but what the real use of it is, and then what that application could look like in the broad sense of when you're putting it all in this giant suit.
For sure. So, like, being evidence-based is about, one, using the literature, using the science as a base, then using your experience, and then the athlete's preferences and unique circumstances. Science allows us to, if we drop the analogy of being in a maze without any light, it's maybe like a candle or a very short torch or whatever. So it allows us to have some sort of direction, and then inform our practice based on our experience and the experience of others.
I love that analogy.
That's Eric Helms. Shout out to Eric Helms who used that, because there's this science is, people want absolute answers, and we saw that outside of sports science. And whenever science gets involved, if it's sickness, if it's this, people want, okay, is it A or B? And if it, like, they don't get that there's nuance to it. But in our world, and back in the day, I guess, not my day, but you'd rely on anecdotes of coaches or lifters and, the X method. And then essentially what that was poorly performed science, not poorly in a bad way, but like it was a collection of observations that, we did this without really much control of other variables, and we saw that this worked, therefore that's what we're going to do now. Where science tries to do that in a much more controlled way, so you can see what matters and what not. For example, like we're seeing that, okay, you can be far away from failure. You don't need to be grinding every single rep in training to see really solid strength gains. Sure, anecdotally, that has been observed as well, and there were many lifters that were preaching that, but I'm sure everybody remembers the difference in like the different schools of thought. Seiko versus, I don't know if it would be versus Westside, but versus people that would be much more pro volume and higher load on the bar. And then science comes in and tells you, okay, you both work because of this and that and the other. So being evidence-based and being science-based as a lifter, obviously there's this caricature of the nerd that comes in and whatever, trains like a pussy. Can I curse?
Yeah, but I think you guys are kind of destroying that, though.
We're trying.
I think that's a shitty excuse anymore.
Yeah.
Because there's enough, doctors and people with PhDs who actually train and are in the trenches that becomes a pretty flimsy, and I don't hear it. Maybe you do because you're in it, but I don't hear it as often. Yeah. Is what it used to be a decade ago.
Yeah, for sure. A decade ago, it was much worse, but it's still a bit like people are not going to read the studies. Let's get that. Like people will barely read the headline of the post reporting on the study, and they will have
which was based on the abstract alone.
Which was based on the abstract.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, like, we're science communicators. If I want to communicate the findings of a new study, I have to either go with, okay, here's a slide with 500 words that nobody's reading, or here's the headline and a bunch of nuance in the caption where you can be like, oh, okay, now this is put in perspective. Because I talked about my own studies and I said there's limitations, maybe peaking, warm-up sets, small sample sizes, yada, yada, yada. But people will just grasp the title or the one statement and they will then run with that. And then that creates sort of a false perception of science in echo chambers where people repeat these things. They're like, oh yeah, these science guys said this, when in reality, nobody said that. They said, yeah, this is what we found, but terms and conditions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But as a lifter, you'd be doing yourself a disservice to not look at the science, to not look at, okay, they controlled for these variables, they took a bunch of lifters, and you don't need to take everything at face value, or not everything weighs the same. You can look at a study in untrained participants, let's say the one we briefly talked before we started recording, where comparing isometrics at long muscle lengths versus a full range of motion that is ongoing now. You as a coach or as a lifter, you can look at that study and be like, okay, interesting. I'm not going to base my whole training philosophy around it or change my ways, but it is a piece of knowledge that I can integrate in my practice to a certain extent. Because people see things very black and white. It's either, okay, there's a new study, okay, 100% weight on this study, versus, cool, just take it for what it is, the same way you take an anecdote.
Yeah.
Do you think then a big part of the problem in reality is people have false expectations about what studies are actually telling them? So, in reality, all a study can ever really do, let's say you've got two groups, is that it's going to say, in this specific context, X did better than Y.
Yeah.
And then the idea is that hopefully you get enough studies that all look similar, that you've got enough of those equations where you can say, okay, well, X works better than Y, but Z works better than X, so on and so forth. You build up this kind of picture, whereas most people will just look at it and take it as gospel.
Yeah.
Whereas all it's ever telling you is just in that certain circumstance with this exact protocol, this outperformed this by a certain amount, the idea is that over time we develop some kind of mechanistic idea of why that happens. And do you think it's just down to people don't want to wait for that research to happen, or they don't want to do enough research to actually study that?
I think there's obviously an inherent, I think it's part of, human nature or something, for there to be some form of greater conspiracy or somebody to go against. But when it comes to actually interpreting research, perhaps a lack of education, or like a knee-jerk reaction to seeing things being trendy. But in reality, like, if you are reading studies and taking what you're seeing in a study's conclusion as a 100% truth, and then you run with that, then okay, like, that's your issue. Like, as a coach and as an athlete, you are supposed to use your experience. You're supposed to listen to the coach who's not a scientist, who will tell you X, Y, Z, and then put all those things together and come to an educated, semi-educated conclusion. In some cases, in powerlifting, for the majority of things, we have zero evidence. We don't have a study on accessories. Does a floor press actually increase bench press strength? Does a safety bar squat transfer to your deadlift? And so on and so forth. Will we stop doing those things? If one study comes out now showing that a safety bar squat translated the exact same to a low bar squat, should you now make every low bar squatter ever do only safety bar squats? No. But you could go like, okay, there was that one study. So now that your shoulder hurts or whatever, and you have this discomfort, we can bias a bit more, a bit of your volume there. But yeah, it's just people want they want the answer. And that's where I'm sure you guys as coaches as well have seen that with people you've worked with, where they're like, okay, so what is it? This or that? And it's like, we don't know for sure. We need to figure that out.
But I think at a fundamental level, people know that in other contexts, right? Like you mentioned Shico. Like if we all went to a Shico seminar or whatever for like 3 days, we wouldn't all come out of it and go, well, now every client I have is going to do Shico.
Some people would.
Yeah, some would.
Do you think that would happen? Because I think most of us would come away and just be like, okay, well, I learned there's going to be a couple of gems of wisdom in there for a couple of days, right? And then you take that away.
Yeah, but a lot of people don't have the critical thinking skills to disseminate. Like if you go to a Shico seminar, whatever it is, some people are just going to be, for lack of a better word, sheep, just looking for how to be able to implement this. And just, I've seen it with Kanji, and so forth. Instead of trying to look at the variables that are actually could be the potential drivers on why this is actually working. Right. That takes critical thinking, you know, because maybe Shiko works just because there's more technical acuity. Don't know. I mean, we don't know, but it needs to be thought about. Like maybe that's the reason. Maybe Westside doesn't work because there is a lack of the technical acuity compared to other programs. But that takes that person to be able to sit there and say, here's all the variables. You know, maybe the time at Westside worked just because it was a community of like-minded people and they just all getting after the whole thing, right? I mean, you have to be able to think. I don't think most people do think that.
Yeah. So do you think in many circumstances then maybe there needs to be a mindset shift where, like, when people are looking at studies or training philosophies on a whole, they're looking for the differences to determine which one's better, right? Whereas do you think people should be more looking at what the similarities are? Like what do all the studies have? What do all the studies consistently find? You know, whether it might not be in this circumstance, it was 50% better, but if it always comes out at least marginally better in 10 different studies, then you're like, oh, okay, now there's maybe something to this, as opposed to just going, well, there's this one study over here that didn't find a benefit to whatever it was, and then people will just pigeonhole on that.
Because he didn't know the frog thing, he might not know this thing as well. There's another analogy that you have a big jar, then you put in the biggest rocks, right? I mean, so strength and conditioning, obviously, those are going to be the sets, the reps, the load, you know, the sleep, the recovery. But after you fill that jar with all the big rocks, there's space between the rocks. Right. So then you can put in pebbles to be able to fill that space.
Exactly.
Right. And then you can, after that, you can put in sand. And then even after that, you can put in water. Like water would be like the margins, the very thin margins, which happens to be where everybody wants to focus their attention because the margins are attractive. You know, it's clickbaity and all the other stuff. But the rocks, once they can assimilate what those are, and it's not sexy, it's not attractive. Most people, to your point, most people know what they are. Like if you're really to pull them aside, you got to work hard. You know, what does that mean, right? Well, the science can help us determine what that actually means from physical, biological, mental angle, whatever it's going to be. And they just need to be reminded of that, which is tough. And the world we live in now, because we could sit here and talk about those basic things and nobody's going to give a fuck.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Exactly what you said. This is exactly it. Like the unfortunate reality is that, and that's why I'm not a huge fan of methods per se, or at least how they're packaged, is because people will be like, oh, I'm doing this method. And then they feel that, okay, this method is inherently better than the other method because of some magical element. But in reality, it's big rocks, taking the basic boxes and then using obviously your own experience and preference and unique circumstances to adjust the minor things. But in reality, for a lot of people, they can't, I feel that they can't grasp that, bro, the reason you're not getting stronger is not because you're missing out on the method or the rep range or the exercise, is because you've done the basics, and there comes a point where things will slow down. We looked at, I'm ADHDing and now opening multiple doors, but we did a study looking at powerlifting strength over time. And we looked at, we used the openpowerlifting.org database to look at thousands of lifters over years, over decades. And essentially over the first year of powerlifting or so, total strength increases. And we looked at just IPF lifters. Apologies.
Well, you're removing variables. Well,
yes, exactly.
Kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, enough of it to make,
removing.
Yeah. More so than not, right? Yeah. So more so than not.
So we saw that over the first 2 years, 7.5 to 12% increase in total. And then over the next 10 years, the same increase, but over 10 years. So people, like, just because you're exposed to so many freaks online and you're seeing people now like a 7-plate deadlift, now it's like whatever, if you're in our echo chamber. So I think that people get a bit disappointed that they're not continuously like breaking PRs and becoming these sort of elite lifters, and then they feel like they're doing something wrong, when in reality it's like train heavy-ish, make sure you're recovering, do enough training volume, which for strength is not even an extreme amount, and just stay with it for 10 to 20 years. Maybe there's a few things you can change to get that competitive edge if you're a competitive powerlifter. But as far as your overall strength and potential goes, it's not that you didn't do the banded hyperextension back of sets that is keeping you back. If you're a world record title contestant, maybe it is, maybe it's not. But for most people watching and listening, it's the lack of consistency and stress outside of the gym, yada, yada, yada. And obviously your genetic potential, which people don't realize. Like, that's why I've started to push people to look more at their strength in terms of percentile, and use like websites like strengthcheck.me, where essentially it compares your strength to all the powerlifters in the world using openpowerlifting.org. And for many people, like if they put their numbers in there, they'll be like, oh, I'm at the top 30% in the world.
Yeah, what's that website again?
Strengthcheck.me.
I like that because I will refer a lot of people just to go to Open Powerlifting and look at how they rank amongst everybody in their weight class.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they're surprised, right? Because they are seeing the influencers and so forth, or not the influencers, but the strongest people are posting. Like the bottom 50% of a weight class on Open Powerlifting probably isn't posting all their training on Instagram, right? But then when they go look, they're like, holy shit, I'm stronger than
What's your squat?
My best ever, 260 kilos raw.
At what weight?
100 kilos, so 220.
And where would you think you'd rank?
Below mid of the pack, I'd imagine.
Okay, so was that in a drug tested comp?
No, WPC.
So 100 kg and you did 260.
Yeah.
You would be better or equal than 94%.
Cool. I'll lean on that very heavily.
Yeah. It goes in the bio, man.
Yeah,
it goes in the
it.
Instagram bio.
I'm in the top 6% squatters.
Yeah, we're going to put a link to that in the description because that's a way faster and easier way than to go and scroll.
And I think on top of that, then the thing you can add maybe another layer to that is what percentage of people in a gym or who lift then compete. Because usually the people who are going to be drawn to compete are usually the ones that are maybe a little bit better than average anway, if you understand, because they're going to have a bit more confidence, right? Yeah. They're going to think, whereas, a lot of people ask the question, like, how much do I need to lift to compete? They maybe presume they shouldn't, or they can't, whatever. So then you're in the whatever percentile of a certain percentile that actually compete who lift, which means you're probably the strongest person on any given gym pretty much on an average day, right?
That's it, man. And that's where people lose their minds. They have this idea of like infinite progression, and that there's the same with muscle mass.
Oh yeah.
People have lost the plot with muscle growth standards. They will look at people that are bigger than 99% of the population, and because online it's a game of angles, and if you're very lean, obviously I'm biased because I'm not lean, but if you're very lean, you can take a picture and look insane, and people have this assumption that I can look like a 3D monster in clothes all the time, when in reality it's like, unless you're blessed, and I mean blessed, your maximum muscular genetic potential will have you looking really good in a shirt, and without your shirt, for the average person, you look super impressive. But for us, because we've been conditioned to look at monsters, people be like, oh, okay, some guy that lifts. So I think that's why there's this inherent search for constantly, what's the new sexy thing I can do? What's the method or the adjustment? And as you said, you do an episode on, hey, keep training consistently and do the basics. Nobody's watching that. Nobody wants to hear that.
I think it was like maybe 20 years ago. I think it was a Jim Wendler article, either on Teenage or on Elite FTS. I can't remember, where he basically said this was kind of starting to happen, where people's perceptions were starting to skew because powerlifting was growing and all the records. And he just said, as a coach or as a lifter, if you're getting to a double body weight squat or 2 to 2.5 times body weight, and bench, you may be 1.5 or 1.25 if you're a male, and approaching 3/4 or body weight if you're a female, then you are probably in the top 10 to 5%, and that isn't a sign to be then disheartened, and that really still rings true now. It's not like as a species we've evolved and should have higher expectations on average, right? It's just now, because powerlifting's a bit more in vogue, we're seeing all the freaks come through, and there's been improvements in training and all that, but the average genetic person still has the average genetics, you know?
So if we're actually to define consistency within the scientific realm of standard deviations that matter, like how would we define that? Because we can say be consistent, but then that's a very open, loose way to define something.
Sure. So like if we then take it back to minimum effective dose, you know, as a lifter, based on the science and the observations of elite coaches and athletes, that even showing up a couple of days in the gym and doing one single will allow you to still, at the very least, maintain your strength. So just making sure that you are lifting ideally 90 to 95% of the year, and you're covered. But it's difficult to pinpoint it or give you an exact definition of what consistency is. But do your best to not stop lifting. And you know, as a lifter, that you can do easier sets and those are still going to be productive for strength. From a hypertrophy standpoint, 4 fractional sets per week was found to be the minimum effective dose. So, and fractional means that for like a bench set would also count as half a set for your triceps as volume. So it's like, it's really not rocket science. And I think a lot of people, and that's where I'm happy my PhD project helped, is they had the idea that unless I'm gunning for that 100%, there's no point in going to the gym. So if I have 30 minutes to train, I can bang out a proper session in 15 minutes. I can do something here. Maybe not a strength workout, but from a hypertrophy perspective, I can get to the minimum effective dose, which is not maintenance dose. I'm still seeing some gains. Yeah. So doing your best to never stop lifting and never have those, I've had a couple of months off. That, in my opinion, is the way you are really going to get there. And if you really want to, you can make it work.
Oh, I think that's a huge takeaway, because in full transparency, outside of like my squat day on Saturday, I really don't want to fucking train most of the time. But I can, within 12 minutes, get enough shit done during the week to be able to have a minimal dose, to be able to not have my weekend training fall to the fucking shitter, right? And it's a few sets on a fucking chest press, you know, it's like 3 different exercises.
It's still tough.
And that's it. And it's enough, right, to be able to maintain, compared to just not doing anything at all, you know, becomes that problem. But what you're stating and what we're talking about just also can kind of lead into the importance of having some periodized program, right? Because you can have a whole block, which is just all that, right? And then you have a higher volume block, then you're going to have different adaptations, you know, just because of that change in what that was from one to the other, instead of just a spurious, you know, throw shit against the wall and show up twice a week and that will still cover the bases, but I don't know how well that's going to actually increase the performance.
Yeah, sure. It's just a case of like, if you're a competitive powerlifter, ideally, do your best to be on some form of program. But even as a competitive powerlifter, there will be, you know, the birth of your kid, the whatever job, the economy, the whatever. And then all of a sudden, there's 2 months of things are much shakier than they were before. Instead of going, you know what, fuck it, I can't train to 100%. I can't do the optimal program on paper. That's where you consult your coach, or if you're coaching yourself, you come up with something that will get you 60 or 70% of the gains. The same way, like, it's crazy because people don't think like that in many other areas of their life, like finances. You won't go, well, I can't make 100% of the potential money I can make, might as well be homeless. You'll be like, you know, it's the exact same thing. It's the exact same thing in training. If there's no way for you to get it in because your recovery capabilities are affected or your time availability is affected, 60% of potential gains is better than 0%. So yeah, that would be my takeaway, because you see it with a lot of people. I've seen lifters, because yes, science, schmines, whatever. I'm a lifter at heart. I love lifting. And I've seen people, and I can't relate to them, where they love lifting as well, and all of a sudden they've been away from the gym for 6 months, which I can't understand. And for many of them, it's that thought process of like, it's the same with diets as well. If I can't do things optimally, I think that anything less than 100% is 0%. So I'm not going to do anything, which is entirely not the case.
Do you think the underlying foundation of that mindset, though, might be the expectation of progressions? Because you mentioned there with the open powerlifting analogy, after the first 2 years, it took 10 years to get the 7 to 12%, right? So if we take that and say an average of 10 over 2 years, just for argument's sake, say 2% a year, you could maybe, let's say we apply that to for someone who's interested in hypertrophy. You have 150 pounds of lean body mass per year. You can maybe expect to put on 3 pounds, 2%. If people had that in the back of their head and that's how they framed their expectations, do you think that might change things? Because in your head, if you think, well, I'm only going to, improve 2% this year. Okay, well, if I can only train twice a week, that's probably still okay.
Yeah.
Whereas in your head, if you're like, I need to put 10% on my total by my next meet, and now all of a sudden you can't follow the perfect periodized plan, you're like, well, now I'm fucked.
Yeah, exactly that. No, I feel that people have this skewed perception of what progress actually looks like in the real world, both because of social media and both because, people that get into powerlifting is a sport where you're getting that feedback, that dopamine from seeing the weight increase on the bar. And there will come a point where unless you gain a bunch of weight and move to a different weight class or use PDs or whatever, you are not going to be able to see massive increases in load in short periods of time. So that's where you need to, one, G-check yourself, and two, adjust your definition of meaningful, which many big lifters do, and that you will see them be like, I managed to hit a total that is 10 pounds or whatever, 50 pounds off my best. So all of a sudden, their definition of meaningful has shifted from, is it going up, to, okay, I've achieved my best total 3 years ago. I had a bunch of shit going on in my life, and I'm getting back to that peak again. That's meaningful to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to take a pee real quick, so we'll break real quick. All right, so we're going to jump back into this, and before I let Tom start going deep in the weeds, you mentioned something earlier about the effective rep thing. And the effective rep, I see things in like two different worlds. I see it in a hypertrophy world, then I'll see things in a strength world, right? And there's hypertrophy, in my brain, there's like strength hypertrophy, then muscle hypertrophy. And to me, there is kind of a difference because of the intent and how much force will be applied. But we can talk about that later because maybe I'm completely fucking wrong. But when the effective rep narrative was being pushed, and that one actually lasted quite a while. I mean, for narratives in this industry, usually it's pretty fast spinning. A couple months is like really good. It was like a year. And the thing I always wondered about that was I can grasp onto the understanding about the effective reps for growth and for hypertrophy. Where I started to get a little lost in the weeds were they're the reps that are leading up to those effective reps. You can't say they're not doing anything, right? Because they're going to build work capacity, in some way or another. Maybe they may build some type of strength endurance, assuming it's over 40%, right? So it's like a blind range, like that 40% to whatever that effective rep range.
But then the question becomes, why is the cutoff there also?
Well, that's what I'm saying is now, like I said, I'm looking at this from the strength angle, right? Because those repetitions, if it's, an 800-pound squatter, obviously there's more warm-up reps, or there should be, instead of just 4 sets to be able to get there. And the load's higher, right? So now there's a 600 triple, 700 triple, maybe 750 triple. I mean, all that work capacity, but yet none of those are going to fall in this effective rep camp because they're 5 reps away from failure or whatever, but it's still a significant amount of workload in that one little area. And the way things were being presented wasn't taking that into consideration. Like, well, if you strip out that range, and if they could hypothetically just go from 225, to whatever that 700 was, you just took out maybe 3/4 of the workload from that set that's being put in there. And now how that relates back to hypertrophy, I don't know, not my world. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on, and you just said that some things have been shifting a little bit on the effective reps as well. So what's been the life cycle of that? Right?
So, in my opinion, the easiest and the simplest way to think about it is to just look at the effect of proximity to failure and how that affects hypertrophy and strength.
Okay, before you continue, how are we going to anchor failure for those people that are listening?
So we're going to define...
Or how does the science do it?
Yeah, so we'll define failure as the point of task failure, which in those studies is the point where you cannot perform the specific task that you're required to perform, which in the majority of cases is a full range of motion repetition, the point where you cannot perform another repetition after you've attempted to do so.
Right. So in the studies, and I'm just doing this for clarity because I already know the answer. So in a lot of the studies that did this, how did they monitor the arousal level of the person going into the set, right? Because you can have untrained people that really don't know what's going on, you know. Granted, you can also hit ammonia salts and take ephedrine and pre-workout and shit beforehand, which is going to be different, but not really necessary for what we're talking about. But when you're talking RPE, there's factors that play into that, like what state am I allowed to be in? Can I get more aroused or not get aroused? Because that can be the difference of several reps in an advanced lifter, where a lot of these studies did have people that, I don't want to say were intermediate lifters. So they weren't the beginners that a lot of people are saying that these people are.
Yeah.
And with the controls on that, I believe with a lot of those, they were people that already had some background in what failure was.
Yeah. So interestingly, if and we did like sort of meta-analysis a couple of years ago on how good are people at knowing how close to failure they are.
That was surprising. Go ahead.
Yeah,
that surprised me.
That surprised me as well, because as a coach, I see it all. I'm like, what RP was that? Like 8, and I'm like, brother, if I gave you $50,000 to get another 10 reps, you would have gone 10 reps here. But in the literature, and obviously keep in mind that when you're doing a study where the purpose of the study is to know how good you're predicting how close to failure you are, that's a limitation in itself, because the design of the study and the environment, with the exception of maybe a couple of deception studies where people didn't know what they were actually doing, it's a limitation. It's a specific environment. But in the literature, both trained and untrained individuals across the board and repeatedly seem to be relatively good at knowing how close failure there are in these contexts, right?
Yeah. I mean, this was a this is when I first heard this one. This is one of the few things I actually went and looked up, because I'm like, there's no fucking way. Yeah. There's just no way.
And it kept repeating, though.
Yes, it did.
It's like there were more studies that came out in trained lifters, and I think one was in, I'm not sure if it was power lifters, but strength trained lifters as well on the bench press. And there was one with coaches where there were like certified personal trainers that looked at a lot of video footage, and they were supposed to predict, like at every rep, say, okay, how many reps in reserve is this? And even they were also 1 rep off the actual prediction.
Really?
Yeah, and that was the case for both trained and untrained lifters and coaches across the board.
Untrained coaches?
No, trained.
Okay. I'm like, wait a minute. I gotta go look this one up again.
Yeah, but it doesn't always pan out with our observation and practice. However, it does tell us that if you are told that, okay, like we're gonna
close enough.
Focus. Yeah, close enough. The other issue with the literature is that in some cases failure is vaguely defined, which we're trying to change and make things more transparent. So with like our latest study, we even published video footage of all the participants training, so you can see what failure looked like. Because like in some studies, they'll say volitional failure and define failure as the point where you think that you are close to failure, which based on the literature should be close enough, but based on our experience, may be a bit problematic. However, to go back to the effective reps, like we see that for hypertrophy, specifically for muscle growth, being very close to failure is definitely important. Definitely. Okay. It's likely very important. And we're talking about like being at 0 to 2 reps in reserve. Like being at 0 to 2 reps in reserve versus 4 to 6 reps in reserve can make an appreciable difference. For strength, as long as you're lifting something above 80% of your 1RM, that seems to be more important than how close to failure you are, because you essentially want to maximize force production, and you don't want to be insanely fatigued. Yeah. And especially during higher rep sets, doing a set of, let's say you put whatever X amount on the bar and you go for a set of 10, taking that set of 10, and let's assume that set of 10 is failure at 10. Stopping at 5 and keeping 5 reps in reserve is likely better for strength than pushing all the way to failure, although that's better for hypertrophy. But then even the researchers that did the study, because they are also powerlifting coaches, shout out to Data-Driven Strength, Zach Robinson and Josh Pelland, and I agree, mentioned that like a heavy single or a grinder rep is a skill in it of itself. So you don't need to take every set in powerlifting training extremely close to failure, but it's likely that there is some merit to having the odd, set here and there where you're like, okay, it's do or die. Like, I might not get it. And at the same time, the sets of 5 where you are very close to failure, they are contributing something to strength. They may not be ideal for strength, but they're also contributing to hypertrophy massively. So then you could make the argument that, hey, getting bigger might make you stronger over the long term. Therefore, having those sets as well makes sense. But overall, the idea of like, oh, it's only the last 5 reps that count. You can conceptualize it in that way, but I think it's you could just think that, okay, I need to be close to failure if I want to maximize muscle growth. Gen pop people can be further away from failure and still see some gains. And for strength specifically, lifting heavy stuff, lifting heavy loads is what's important, and you don't need to take everything balls to the wall.
Well, in the strength aspect that you were talking about, is that, I mean, it can be due to a number of different reasons, but would you feel that the primary reason would be because it's just not adding to the systemic fatigue that all the other things are creating? The heavier loads, say doing the accessory set 5 reps away from failure, if it's a leg press, is a 4 movement, compared to doing a balls out set of 20, is going to create more recovery demands for something that really doesn't have any correspondence. Thus would have that negative impact.
Because if you're squatting 3 days later again, you blasting a leg workout and doing leg extensions and whatever, leg press as well, where your glutes, your adductors, everything will be fried. That's going to limit the amount of force you can produce on the subsequent in like 3 days later. But at the same time, and that's where maybe periodization or mixed training comes in, like careful programming comes in the picture, because like as a power lifter, if you are very competitive, you want to also gain muscle over time to at least make, like, we don't know the ins and outs of strength yet in the science and how much actually gaining muscle mass contributes. It does seem that it does help, and it makes sense that it does. So that's where careful programming comes in the picture. But I would say that for the majority of lifters out there, if you're a strength trainee, have your hypertrophy training, have your strength training, but don't necessarily feel like, okay, it has to be all out on one or all out on the other, if that makes sense.
Because I would hypothesize that if it's the strength athlete, yes, the added muscle mass is going to help unless you're in a weight class to where you just can't do that anymore and you are lean. I mean, outliers here. But to be able to do that with the minimal effective dose that you possibly can is going to be create less of that fatigue to be able to have the other stuff kind of build, unless it's a block made just for that, which then those main things would come down.
That's the one thing I've been trying to highlight lately, is that because powerlifters would often conceptualize hypertrophy training as, okay, only either isolation or accessory movements at a specific rep range. But I'm like, look, if you're doing sets of 3 or 4 or 5 on the squat and you're like 3, 2, 4, let's say 4 to 2 reps away from failure, that's contributing to hypertrophy. Maybe it's not ideal, but it's definitely contributing. And taking that in consideration and then doing less accessory work so that you're at the minimum effective dose for hypertrophy, one, allows you to still make gains as far as muscle mass goes, and limits the quote unquote interference effect with your strength work versus going, okay, strength work, I'm not going to count it as hypertrophy training whatsoever, and now I'm going to do a bunch of sets as in the form of accessory work to get bigger. But now I'm overdoing it with the muscle growth work, which is important, but it's not as important as the strength work. Yada yada yada.
Yeah, while also understanding that while they're bench pressing, they are training their triceps.
Exactly.
As they're squatting, they are training their quads, and those are hypertrophy sets for the quads.
Even the set of 3 counts.
True. I think, how much do you think though in this scenario where, if you boil it down enough, they almost end up being the same thing? And what I mean by that is, let's say we take a set of bicep curls, 30 reps, whatever. Obviously, the weight starts out at 40%, but you fatigue at a set percentage. So like 40% becomes 43, 46, 49. If the last 5 or 6 are the ones that count, what percentage of your ability to lift or your 1 rep max at that second in time is it? It's probably like 80+%. Do you know what I mean? That 30-pound bicep curl is now 80+% of what you could curl for one. And then we go and look at hypertrophy. You mentioned 80% generally being like a good rule of thumb to work with. That's usually where we end up getting full fast twitch fiber recruitment, muscle recruitment. Correct me if I'm wrong. So really, they almost end up being the same thing. Okay, that threshold where reps become maximally effective for hypertrophy is where we get full muscle fiber recruitment. If we're after strength, we probably want to start at a point where we have full muscle fiber recruitment from the get-go, because that's what we're trying to train. If we want maximal strength, we need all those fibers working. Could we get it if we start at 70%? Sure, but we need to do 3 or 4 reps to pre-fatigue before we get to the 80%, which at which point is going to cause more muscle damage. There's probably going to be some technical degradation, you know, so
joint wear and tear. I mean, I'll look at things from like long-term joint wear and tear, and that one's kind of like a mind fuck, right? Because it's like, well, there are 30 reps, and if you got bone spurs in the shoulder capsule and it's bone on bone, you're just grinding the shit out of all that. Where some would say, well, that's better, but well, is it better than if it was a really heavy fucking loaded set of 5 with that type of joint wear and tear? I don't know the answer to that, but it becomes this and or like if it's a coding thing, it's, you know, if this, then in other words, it all depends.
And then my question to you then would be, when we're looking at effective reps for strength, you know, let's say we start at 80%, which most people can do like 5, 6, whatever reps with. The idea of staying away from that for maximal strength. Now, is that, in your opinion, because there's some kind of systemic fatigue with those compound lifts as we get closer to failure, as in the neurological fatigue kind of disproportionately increases? Or is it that, you know, when we look at hypertrophy, we're looking at leg extensions, whatever, we can get true movement failure because it's so simple? Whereas, how do you define true movement failure on a squat? Because you're going to have what rep 1 looks like, which is theoretically the perfect squat for that person. Does rep 4 even look like that? Is there a shift? Is the hip coming up early or whatever? In that point, have you hit true movement failure at rep 3 because the squat now looks slightly different? You know, and maybe is that why there's more benefit to staying further away, because you're not actually training the same thing technically? Do you get why I'm asking that?
Yeah, it's very difficult to not conceptualize, but rather to quantify or define movement and say, okay, like because like there's definitely it's definitely on a spectrum, like, and the standards that we've created for when a movement is solid or not, those are somewhat influenced by aesthetic standards to an extent. Obviously, that comes, you know, being mechanically advantageous when you're performing a squat. That's part of it as well. But what I would say is that you don't want to be you don't want to get super fatigued from your strength work to the point where you're adding unnecessary fatigue without any gain. So let's say you take 80%, instead of going for 5, let's say 6 is your max, the max reps you can do. Stopping at 3 or 4, stopping at maybe 2 or 3 will likely get you the same strength gains and the same skill practice as going closer to failure, because then you're adding unnecessary fatigue without any actual gain.
Would that be
for
assuming
strength.
you do equal volume in the end? So like two sets of 5 converted to 5 sets of 2. Would that need to happen to get the same strength gains in that scenario?
Based on the current volume recommendations for strength, as long as you're somewhere in the 4 to 6 sets per movement per week, you're covered. So you just base it off that. But going in and saying, okay, I'm going to bang out 2 super hard sets of 5, if that's all you have time for, you may be getting a bit more of a bang for your buck situation because you're getting some hypertrophy adaptations as well. But if you're just a strength athlete, breaking those down to smaller sets makes more sense. And then obviously looking at your weekly volume and making sure that fits there.
Yeah, sure.
Does that make sense?
Well, when you throw in the technical aspect, it can change things though too.
Yeah, for sure.
Because if they're not solid on their technique, the first 2 could be solid, and as you noted earlier, the next 3 will be non-optimal. So then they're, from a technical acuity standpoint, for a competitive lifter, you know, defining that fully out. Not a competitive lifter, probably a little bit different conversation. More the sets of 2 done properly would stand to reason that would be better. You know, or even singles, if it was all singles, would stand better because of that. The hope would be, if you could study these people, that this wouldn't be a variable, that they would be able to maintain pretty solid technique within one standard deviation from rep 1 to set 5.
Sure.
Yeah.
But in real application with most people, that's probably not going to be the case, because you're going to need a high skilled lifter, and there's going to be those technical breakdowns where, when you're studying some of these other things like the length and position and all these, how are you going to control for that technical variable? I get it. You can put them on a machine and isolate them, but, you know, there's ways to do that. But when you're talking more compound, let's say you were talking about a cheat curl, regular, you know, a regular curl, which I'm very interested to hear the thoughts upon that, is how do you control that variable? Because even if it's an intermediate, but it's a new movement, they're going to skillfully and neurologically learn how to do that movement better throughout the time of the study, which can be attributed to some of that strength increase.
Yeah.
Unless they've already had experience doing that movement for years.
Yeah. So that's where you're opening a big curtain and you're like, oh, so first things first, like with strength work specifically, that's why I think that, yes, overall, try to not be super close to failure all the time as a strength athlete. But in order to build, in my opinion, at least, the technical fortitude, the capacity, in order to become a skilled lifter at handling heavy load the way you will have to handle it in competition, you have to have those grindy reps that may not look ideal, and it's a skill. You need to know what's happening when the deadlift starts slowing down around your knees. If you've never done that before in competition, it's likely, maybe it's not the case in reality, but it's likely, in my opinion, that you will be in a position where you're going to be like, okay, what am I doing here?
Yeah.
And that's where you're throwing some work that may not look as technically pleasing at the beginning, or ever. I think it's still useful in small doses, like having those sets where things get really tough, and you might pause your bench, and then one elbow comes up, one arm comes up faster, the other doesn't. Is there something inherently wrong with the lifter? Maybe not. But going through those reps is important, in my opinion, because that's what you're going to be faced with in competition.
Yeah.
So
they need to learn how to think and strain at the same time.
Exactly.
And you can only do that through experience.
But it shouldn't be all the time. You see lifters do that sometimes.
Yeah.
Every session is ammonia, heavy metal, and it's like grinding, which sure, you're still going to make gains because you're doing your warm-up set, you're still lifting heavy weight, but it's likely not going to be ideal. As far as studies go, the control for technique, especially when you don't have people in like doing a leg extension, there's general guidelines, but if you look at the videos that we published, which I think we're maybe one of the first, if not the first group that actually published a lot of video footage of participants training, you'll see there's a lot of variation between individuals on how they perform the exercise, and things are not perfectly controlled, which is a limitation, because you're trading essentially internal validity for external validity. But in the real world, you're not going to you're not going to have people squat the exact same way. Reps are not going to look identical, and depending on the exercise as well, things will vary from individual to individual and rep to rep. So then that's something also that I think a lot of people have this misconception about, that things will look robotic all the time, and unless they do, that's a bad thing. But in the real world, that's not what it looks like. Even with elite lifters, yes, they will be very good at squatting, but there will still be some variation from some reps to some reps, depending on the load they're using, the rep range, yada yada yada.
In your opinion, mentioning the slow, higher tension reps, do you think the skill acquisition there, and this is a question to both of you, comes from the actual level of strain, i.e. the difficulty of the rep, as in you have to get used to that, or does it come from the movement speed? So like, for example, in Olympic weightlifting, there's a camp of thought about like dynamic correspondence, where like they should lift their warm-ups at the same kind of speed their maximal attempts will move at, which is, you know, in weightlifting is easier to kind of conceptualize because it's power based. The idea being that if you move all your warm ups at a speed that's considerably faster than what your higher sets will do, your timing is different. Maybe you're using the speed to mask positional issues or technical issues like that. Do you think that the same maybe happens then in powerlifting, which obviously is absolute strength as opposed to power, where when a weight gets slow enough, maybe we uncover technical deficiencies that we don't normally see just because the rep speed is so slow and there's not enough momentum to carry it through? Or do you think it's that they genuinely don't know how to strain that hard?
Anecdotally, the way I'm going to answer this, just from what I've seen, is it's not load based, it's strain based, right? So if for instance, you know, somebody is overreaching or they're not recovering and they're doing conjugate and it's max effort work, you know, one way to kind of get around that, well, there's two ways. You can get around it by switching the bar, so the load's going to decrease, but the strain's still going to be there. But the other way to do it is to control the tempo, you know, to use a slower tempo. Now the weight goes down, right? Which in my brain and what I've seen, it's a little bit easier for them to recover from, because now instead of 700 pounds, it's going to be 500 pounds at a slower tempo. And the strain is going to be harder too. Because even if they want to try, so if you want to have them do the concentric in 4 seconds, right? Well, they're still, if it's they're going to strain, but at the same point in time, there's going to be some point during the harder reps where they're going to try to move at a higher velocity than the 4 seconds, because it's fucking hard, right? But so my answer to that would be, from the psychological standpoint of what we're talking about, the ability to think in strain. And I would say what that really, the end result of that would be the deadlift example that you were talking about. You get to your knees and you're a little bit out of position, you know, non-advanced lifter that has mastery of that, and their brain is just going to be screaming, you know, just, and a master type lifter, it's going to be, why am I in this position? Because everything with maximum weights is going to start to move in slow motion in your brain. Like, what is not in the right position? Do I need to push my glutes in? Do I need to, you know, try to turn my knees? What do I need to try to activate to be able to correct this? Am I looking too far up? Where's my head? You know, all that processing. And that doesn't happen unless you have that experience straining, right? So, you know, physically, it could be a different answer, you know, because of the compensatory acceleration and so forth, but they still mentally need to be able to process and do that. And sometimes it could be pin pulls against bands, or just something that's going to slow the tempo down than what they would normally have, even if it's a half second or a second, for that mental processing to occur, which isn't going to happen with a beginner. It's probably not even going to happen with an intermediate. I mean, we're getting further down the line here. But the more advanced they get, the more detrimental those heavier loads over time, always over 90%, can become the problem, right? Because now you have all that fatigue that's being generated from that. So that would be my answer on that.
Yeah, I echo that.
Yeah, because I suppose then the question then becomes, let's say we're in that scenario where a lifter cannot lift heavy, either due to the wear and tear of the absolute loads or injury, whatever. Can the skill of heavier, slow tempo lifting then, can that box be ticked by maybe performing the concentric purposely slow, but with maximal tension, or with something like an isometric against a pin, you know, where they're locked into a position and they get to strain maximally, whatever. And the reason I'm saying is there's, because in that periodization scheme towards peaking, that could be a way a lifter could keep that skill set fresh.
I would say it'd be more important for the beginner and intermediate.
Sure.
Right? Because they're going to be able to control the technique a little bit better if you're controlling the tempo than if it's just max and grind, max and grind, max and grind. I'm sure you've seen this with people that you work with. You know, weight releasers can play a role in that too, because forget about the weight release properties of all that. They're going to go down slower just because it's a heavier fucking load.
And I guess the reason I'm asking that is because people, whether it's with conjugate or whatever, they will use that as an excuse to overshoot sets that get ugly, when in reality it's like, well, you don't have to do that to learn that skill set. Maybe there are other ways that are better
100%
suited than good morninging, you know, doing a good morning with your 5th rep on your top squat.
And the way that we would do that is that would be, we would feel that overreaching, and then that would just kind of be an untermed deload max effort day. Like, this is just isometric shit this time, right? Because it's not going to be as demanding as all that. But you know, to your point, we get to intermediates and beginners that don't know how to do that. You run into the issue of they don't have the technical acuity to really be able to go at that 90% all the time. So you got injury risk, you got form degradation, you got all this other stuff. And it's so fucking heavy, I don't think they can process. Right now, for the slower tempo with a lower weight, they're not thinking, oh, I'm going to fall forward, you know, oh, this is going to snap off or whatever it's going to be. It's just, this sucks because Tom said I have to come up with a 6-second eccentric, you know, and so they have to get that voice out, like, this sucks, you know, and get the voice in of, am I in the proper position for that?
But this is a really good example of being evidence-based.
Yeah.
Like, we're talking about things that in the science, maybe we've scratched the surface, but that's where your experience come in play, and trialing different things using obviously some scientific reasoning as a base then allows you to slowly piece things together.
Yeah, but we're still getting, if you're looking at what the effective reps for the strength are and where you need to be, this all boils down into that. Because if we need to be in that intensity zone of 80 to 90%, maybe the weight isn't based upon a 1 rep max 80 to 90%, but when we peel it down, it is 80 to 90% of that movement at that tempo, maybe more. You know, so it's the nuance, and it's the water that's above all the rocks and all the other stuff.
But then that opens
but sometimes that water and those, sometimes, this is interesting now, right? Because sometimes the water corrodes the fucking rocks, right? Because if they're not thinking about things like this, and they do default to what you say, I have to max out, balls out with ammonia and everything every Monday because it's max effort day or whatever it is, you know, that's the water fucking spoiling the rock, because you don't understand what the real intent of why you're doing that is, and then the different methods to be able to get the intent that you're looking for.
I mean, then that kind of opens the question, you know, you say there 80 to 90% of 1 rep max can be very different depending on the exercise and the way it's performed. Then you open the question of those accessory movements, or even variation on the main lift, is one of their biggest benefits then, that they allow you to lift in that zone without the wear and tear that would come from just back squatting with a normal tempo at 80, 90% all year round. You know what I mean? You have the ability to work in that zone without it being high absolute loads, high wear and tear, whatever you call it. That slow tempo yoke bar squat, which you're 300 pounds weaker on, is its main benefit, hypothetically, that it allows you to squat at 85% months out without breaking yourself. Whereas if it was a low bar
so
squat,
if it was replacing the movement, and not
from a neurological strength standpoint, you know?
I mean, my brain, that's conjugate, right? But when you first pose that question, I'm thinking that that's a third movement. And then I would be wondering, you know, mentally, are they even going to be able to do that after having all this other work ahead of that? You know?
No, but even as a main, like a variation, if that was their main as opposed to straight bar squatting, is that the big thing they're getting out of it? I wonder, in that scenario, as opposed to it, you know, obviously it's going to work weaknesses or whatever, but is it just that, you know, as you espouse to, we need to be consistent, and if we need to be in the 80 to 90% range consistently, how do we do that without all the ramifications that come with doing that on the same thing all the time?
Well, I'm going to flip that to you from a hypertrophy standpoint. So it's, say, the way that I kind of look at hypertrophy for a strength athlete is if we're looking at daily undulating periodization, and use that way to define it, it's the lower movements that are in there. For bodybuilding and stuff, it's going to be more prioritized and throw up in there. And throughout the last 5-6 years, you know, there's been a push towards, you know, progressive overload of the same movement. Now, if we're talking hypertrophy and just, you know, the stimulus for the muscle to be able to grow, does the movement really matter? You know, if it's a chest fly to a cable fly to a dumbbell fly, are they all not flies that, I mean, old school bodybuilders are changing the movement every time they go in to train a muscle, but they're still, the big rocks are still being checked because of that. So is the movement variation that significant of a indicator? Granted, I get it, the beginners are going to want to have the progressive overload, but a more advanced person that really knows the movement, if they're training to, say, 2 reps shy of failure on week 1, they're not going to get 6 weeks out of that. They're just not, you know, because within week 2, that say they go 2 reps shy of failure, week 2, 1 rep shy of failure, week 3, 2 failure, there's probably not going to be a week 4 where they're going to break this PR,
Yeah.
or a week 5, so what are your thoughts on that? Just hypertrophy alone as well.
Yeah. So it again comes down to, as you said, some basic boxes that one would need to tick. Now, for a strength athlete and a powerlifter specifically, there are things that won't matter as much. So, like, you may not care to have entirely whole hypertrophy of every muscle group because they're not actively doing much for your squat, bench, and deadlift. But as long as you, and that's based on the current literature, right? Things may massively change in the next 10 years or something. But as long as you're training muscles at a sufficiently long length, so you're getting a relatively solid stretch on most things, that seems to be a good bet and a good box to tick if you want to get a solid amount of hypertrophy from exercise. So, for example, if you're doing a belt squat as an accessory for your quads and glutes, going pretty low and getting deep makes sense to get the maximum out of it. As far as varying exercises and varying the stimulus, if you are choosing exercises that feel good for each specific lifter, are somewhat specific to the exercise that you're using them for, so like a squat pattern, a hip hinge pattern, yada yada yada, then you are mostly covered. So there could be an argument to be made about exercises that also have the most tension where that stretches. For example, if you do a dumbbell fly where you have a lot of tension at the bottom versus let's say some machine pec flies that are not as good, you could make the argument that may in isolation be slightly better. But as long as you're training close to failure and you're performing a variety of exercises for each muscle group, meaning like a couple of exercises, 2 or 3 maybe, you are likely ticking most, if not all, boxes. Now, then the question becomes, okay, but what about things like, okay, making sure you're training your rectus femoris for your quads, where you can't effectively train it with a squat. Then you could throw in an isolation movement like a leg extension to do that. Same goes with the long head of the tricep with some overhead work, yada, yada, yada. I'm not sure how important those are for powerlifters because we haven't studied it. Plus, you could make the case that it may not be as important. But as a powerlifter or as a strength trainee, from a hypertrophy standpoint, if you are doing exercises where you can get a solid range of motion in them and they have some tension in the stretch and they feel good, you don't need to think past them. Just make sure you're very close to failure and you're consistently hitting at least 4 to 8 sets per muscle group per week, as far as like effective sets close to failure go from a hypertrophy standpoint.
Now, what if it does not have that stretch in the bottom, say a close grip bench press, for example?
Yeah.
Or I'll make it even more extreme, like a close grip 2-board bench press.
It's likely that it's not ideal for hypertrophy, but at the same time, you're also going to be benching, right?
Yeah.
Likely. You're going to do some tricep extensions, maybe some, I don't know, dumbbell pressing for your chest. But if you are using exercises that are biasing the short portion of the range of motion as the majority of your hypertrophy accessory work, you may be leaving gains on the table. Do I think you're going to leave an entirety of gains on the table? Probably not, because you're still bench pressing and doing all sorts of stuff.
Well, the reason I'm asking that is, powerlifting is basically a sport based upon taking 3 main lifts and trying to do them in the most effective manner with the shortest range of motion with the greatest amount of weight.
Yeah.
Which will typically, for a lot of lifters, will lead to the accessories doing the same thing. And then when you're looking at what the actual full range of motion for that joint is for most lifters, especially upper body wise, I think they're leaving a lot on the table when it comes to the hypertrophy bottom end training that they're doing, significantly, because in most cases pecs, for example, there's no adduction really anywhere, or any deep dumbbell press. It's not like they're grabbing the cambered bench bar to try to, none of this is happening through all that. Then long-term wise, I think over a period of time, 1 rep goes a little south, there's your pec tear, you know, or there's that tricep tendon, or there's the bicepial tendonitis. There's these things that are starting to flare up because they wanted to use more weight on their accessory work, because more weight is more fun than dropping the load and doing a incline dumbbell press with a fuller range of motion instead of using the biggest dumbbells and just barely tapping and kind of going through. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's mostly a difference in lifting culture, because obviously I haven't been exposed to as much of that sort of lifting as you have. But I'd say that would, if you're mostly doing those sorts of movements as your accessories, yeah, you're leaving gains on the table. And at the same time, I think also powerlifters are notorious for half-assing their accessory work.
You think?
Where it's like, bro, if you are training the squad, you know, twice a week and pushing heavy sets and doing all the sort of leg work in the back of it in terms of belt squats and yada, 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 and then you do some band tricep push downs that burn a bit, and then you call that a set. I don't think I know that you're leaving gains on the table. Like if you're trying to grow muscle, the sets that you're doing need to look and be hard and tick some basic boxes. Sure, you want to do your board press or floor press as an accessory to your bench for lockout strength or whatever, that's great. But if you're trying to get your pecs and triceps bigger, having that incline dumbbell press in there and having that, you know, tricep extension where you are getting a nice stretch and then you are taking those hits to failure, that's your best bet as a lifter.
Yeah. With regards to progressive overload on the smaller movements, you know, and people almost using it as an excuse for introducing more variety because they can't do it. Does it simply come down to, again, the rate of progress? For example, if I can do 10 reps with 20-pound dumbbells on lateral raises and I can only get 2 or 3% stronger a year, how long is it going to take me to be able to do 10 reps with 25-pound dumbbells, which is probably the next dumbbell jump for most people, right? Like that's a 25% or whatever increase. So do you think in most scenarios, like you're saying, if the most important thing is just being 5 or 6 reps short of failure, you know, getting some effective reps in there, does it really matter if there's not a progressive overload? Because in reality, that next dumbbell jump is a 25% increase. That's like, you know, if you're squatting and your weight was 405, being like, well, there's no point now, I'll change a movement because I can't put a whole plate on each side. Like proportionally, that's kind of the same thing. You'd never do that, right? But obviously we have the luxury of smaller increases there. So in those scenarios with those smaller movements where the load increase is going to be so minimal over time, is there an argument to be made for progressively higher volume? So like moving from 3 sets of 10 to like 11 and 12 and 13 to increase the stimulus of that weight before making that big jump?
Sure, I would use sets as sort of like not a last resort, but I wouldn't go like, okay, well, it's been 3 weeks, my dumbbell lateral raise is the same, let me add 2 sets now. But I would just go for an extra rep here and there. And keep in mind that it's very difficult, and I see that with a lot of people that I work with, that they view exercises in isolation. You can't really critically evaluate your strength on the dumbbell lateral raise or your tricep push down without taking into consideration everything else that you're doing and how that's progressing. Because like we also tend to view progressive overload in a static way, where there's this assumption that everything is always the same and only that variable is being manipulated. But like, let's even put life stress and nutrition and sleep aside. You coming in and doing more bench press volume or getting that extra rep on the competition bench press, and then also getting that extra rep or heavier weight on the low bar squat where your shoulder is fatigued, then how does that impact that accessory movement? It's all so convoluted that your best bet is to just make sure you're close to failure and over time seeing things progress in one way or another. Because if you see your tricep extension go up by just a tiny bit of weight in a year, but your bench press has also gone up and your dumbbell shoulder press or your overhead press or your whatever press has also gone up, like those things should be triangulated together. Now, if nothing is going up and you're stuck at the same weight for every movement and you're doing the exact same volume every week, that's where you could potentially either add sets or you have to take a step back and see maybe there's something bigger going wrong.
But
here.
You know, in this example, say you've got a guy who always does push downs at the end of his bench session. If he's doing progressively more workload on the bench as his first exercise, whatever happens in the middle, if his tricep push down stays the same, that is a form of progress in of itself.
100%.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what I see with a lot of people. They're like, yeah, I haven't progressed on this much. I'm like, bro, you did more on your shoulder press and your bench press the past 3 weeks, and you're able to do the same sets and reps and the weight on your tricep pushdowns as you were a few weeks when your bench and shoulder press weren't as strong. So you're literally doing more because you're able to match that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, can this be a contributing factor as to why strength athletes don't push the accessories hard? Right? Because you can come to the conclusion that, you know, as long as it's kind of close to failure, it really doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
And then over a period of time, that becomes less and less and less of, so then they fall out of that 5 reps close to failure. Yeah. It's like, fuck it, whatever. It's just push downs. I got to do 2 sets and leave.
Exactly. Like they often refer to it as like, I've seen them call it like fluff work, or like, it's like once you're done squatting, and I used to be a huge fan of the squat. Like there were times in my life where I just squatted. I didn't do anything else.
I can relate to that.
Yeah. So it's like after you finish a few hard sets of squats, then, you know, it's easy to go, whatever. Tries push downs, got a bit of a pump, cool, call it a day. So I think it's more of a cultural thing with accessories, especially because like powerlifting is also a cultural sport, like many sports, and there's trends, there's schools of thought, there's what people see. There's a trend now of like higher volume, ultra specific work going on, at least in some echo chambers. And then that creates a culture where people are potentially pushing accessories less just because they're not viewed as important, or because they are viewed as like, there's buzzwords being thrown around, blood flow, and just people roll with it and they don't critically appraise it because it's not their main area of focus. However, allow me to G-check myself and say we don't have actual empirical evidence to confirm that they're indeed not pushing their sets hard. These are our observations, but then again, touching back on the being science-based and being evidence-based, like our observations count for something as well. And it is true that I see people not pushing their accessories hard.
So if we're looking at hypertrophy and assuming the maximally effective rep principle has some merit and explains a decent amount of what's going on, what role do different rep ranges play then? Because I've just got a study written down here, which is, I'm probably going to pronounce all these names wrong, but Fischetti 2020. This was quite a good study where they basically had people do high reps, they had people do low reps, and then they had people do a combination of both. The people who did a combination of both had significantly more hypertrophy than the individuals that only did high or low. Now, there was 1 or 2 other studies, I believe, that found similar results. So obviously, if you assume they're all equal, there shouldn't be a difference, right, between those results. Do you think that's something that's worth exploring? Do you think there are unique benefits to certain rep ranges for hypertrophy?
I think it is a good educated bet to vary things because you're not losing anything on the back of it. Do I think...
What do you mean by losing anything on the back of it?
Like if you do some stuff in the 5 to 10 rep range as your accessory work, as your hypertrophy work, some of it in the 8 to 12, and a couple of exercises at 15 to 20, chances are that you're not going to be... We know from the literature that as long as you're close to failure, you're going to make similar muscle gains. So, but there is some evidence indicating that there may be something to varying your rep ranges, and you varying your rep ranges is not going to cost you more time, allows for more flexibility, and being fixed to one rep range doesn't, like, it's not giving you anything more, you know? However, I'm personally a big fan, and now we're not talking about the strength athlete strictly anymore, but like in general for hypertrophy work, I think staying within 5 to 12 reps is good. Because if we look back at how good are people at gauging how close to failure there are data, things started looking a bit off after 12 reps. So that's where predictions were a bit shitty. So by keeping things relatively heavy and still having enough of a variety there, you can ensure that you're close to failure. And at the same time, there's nothing inherently wrong with doing a tricep pushdown at 6 reps. But then again, ADHD. But we're talking about experience and personal preference. You may be like, bro, I'm not doing a tricep pushdown at 6 reps. It's destroying my elbows. And that's where you can go, okay, You can do it at 15. It's totally fine. That's where the science tells you it's cool. But having a variety, I think, makes sense from every standpoint. One, educated bet at maximizing adaptation. And two, there's definitely, okay, maybe I'm being too absolute, but there's likely going to be a preference issue with many exercises and many lifters. Not everybody will like 8 to 10 reps on whatever push downs. So being able to vary things will allow for the lifter to buy into training and be more consistent to training as well.
And what about the idea then that doing the higher rep training causes a higher degree of like central fatigue, cumulative fatigue, and would then be harder to recover from? Do you think that actually plays a big enough of a role for people to bias towards lower rep ranges? Or do you think for the vast majority of people, that's a variable that probably is negligible?
The latter, unless you're the one freak that is doing everything in the 25 to 30 rep range or that 15 to 20 rep range. So like, I know that argument alongside with the effective reps model argument are being pushed out there quite a bit. And it's the same fear as with training to failure. Yes, bro, if you're taking everything to the fucking end and you're that one crazy guy or girl, sure. But overall, I think there's a bit of fear-mongering around fatigue and how much overall it will play. And there's an inherent assumption that you're going to be doing everything like that. Like, do I think that you doing 4 sets of tricep pushdowns at 15 to 30 reps per week because they feel better on your elbow is going to deter your muscular growth or strength? No. Do I think that you going, okay, I'm going to do everything high rep range may in the long term affect some things negatively because some exercises, especially maybe like lower body work, will be super fatiguing and will affect your ability to train? Yeah. Do I think that will be a bad idea for a strength athlete? Yeah, probably.
You noted that in that answer that not for the strength athlete. I have a bias that I should put out there because I think it's extremely important for the strength athlete to understand, the nuance and the science behind the hypertrophy to the greatest degree they possibly can, if it's full range of motion, strength, position, and all that, simply because they have less time to devote to it. If they do have a training block set out for that, maybe it's 4 or 6 weeks, once or twice a year, so 12 weeks, and by the way, they think they're going to put on significant muscle mass in that time period over a whole year, where they have those periods in there, but then the time that's devoted on the bottom end of those training sessions need to be the best minimal effective dose they possibly can, in my opinion, with the lowest volume and the highest output, just so it doesn't disrupt the main thing that they're trying to build, while still having it in there. Because this is where my bias is. I do think it still has to be in there, if not just for joint integrity, but stability and, muscles that aren't getting trained on those other lifts, where if they don't put the time into figuring out what the minimal effective training stimulus is going to be for all that, they're either not going to do it at all, which we see, which my bias is going to predict that they're going to have issues because of that later down the line, or they do it like a dump buck, right? And, everything's just, hanging and banging, heaving and pressing shit for an hour after all their other stuff. And it's, not to any more value than if they did whatever that minimal effective part is. So I don't think they listen enough or look enough at what you guys are putting out or what bodybuilders are putting out to determine what that is, from that standpoint, because they don't have the time to dedicate to it, but yet can't lose it for one. And I guess they're probably not going to lose it even if they're doing the main stuff, but could run into those other issues down the line.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. I'm very empathetic to that stance. I hadn't really considered it that way. But in that case, as I mentioned before, based on the current literature, training at a sufficiently long muscle length makes sense. It may be that in 10 years we find out that some muscles don't benefit much from that, but you're not losing a whole lot by doing so. So you don't need to become a ballerina and do insane stretches or do insane ranges of motion, but not skipping the bottom part on a bench press, or maybe using a cambered bar or dumbbells to get a bit of an extra stretch makes sense. Keeping things close to failure, staying ideally, in my opinion, in the 5 to 15 rep range, just to make sure that you can be as accurate as you can at gauging proximity to failure, including 2 to 3 exercises per muscle group. And then from a technique standpoint, because that's something that we briefly looked at, we did a narrative review, which is essentially a glorified blog post, but in a scientific way, on technique. We don't know much about technique and its effect on hypertrophy, whether, slightly twisting your elbow actually makes a big difference, or whether slight slight changes in positioning actually make a big difference in how much muscle you'll grow. So as long as you are following textbook technique to a great extent and adjusting that for your own anthropometric characteristics, and you are biasing long muscle lengths, without that meaning you should only be doing partials or doing anything extreme, you're covered. From a tempo perspective, things seem to be super flexible. You don't need to have a super slow eccentric or a super slow concentric, as long as your overall repetition duration is somewhere around 2 to 8 seconds. So that could be slower for some things if there's any discomfort, or if it feels better, it could be faster on other things. As long as you're ticking those boxes, you're covered. So things are much more flexible than previously thought. And now we're going to start opening the door of, okay, do you need to keep things strict and not introduce external momentum? My hunch is that, or at least from my point of view, introducing external momentum is not really, I cannot really see a solid argument for it on the majority of things. So keeping things relatively strict and relatively robot-like makes sense, but without losing your mind. Maybe you're doing a couple of reps on the last pull, on the lat pull down, and those last 2 reps, there is a slide, lean back or something like that. You're still working on long muscle lengths. You're still close to failure. It's not the end of the world. So as long as you're taking those boxes as a power lifter, you're covered.
With body momentum and stuff like that, I'd say even if there is some kind of benefit, it's a variable that's going to be really hard for you to track. Like, are you actually progressively overloading and getting better? Or did you cheat slightly more on the cheat curl? Do you know what I mean? Like, you're introducing a variable that is not really objective. So then your progression system, or at least your perception of your progression, just has this big gray area that you've introduced, But you mentioned tempo.
Yeah.
If we're going close to failure, say you mentioned kind of 2 reps short is probably a sweet spot for hypertrophy. The rep tempo is probably going to be almost governed by the difficulty of the set, at least at the end, right?
100%.
So like, even if we start out those faster reps with, what we perceive as maybe a fast concentric.
If it ain't slowing, you ain't growing.
Yeah, sure. So like, by the end, regardless of what your intent is, it's probably going to end up in the same place, right? So do you think that's a good determinant for, let's say, the powerlifter who wants to kind of sack off his accessories? Just go until there's a notable decrease in rep speed, even if you are trying to move it as fast as you can. Do you think that for people who aren't good with RP and stuff like that, that can just be a pretty good indicator for them?
Yeah, for sure. But also, I would also urge for the odd set to failure as well, to G-check themselves and be like, okay, last set I thought I was 2 reps in reserve. I got 8 reps. Let me do another set now. Oh, I got 14 reps. Maybe that last set wasn't really 2 reps in reserve. Because if you instruct somebody, especially a powerlifter, with their accessory work and tell them, hey, wait until things slow down, the mind is can be tricky. You could be like, okay, yeah, mind muscle connection, whatever, mumbo jumbo, I'm focusing on the muscle. Okay, this slowed down, but they are intentionally slowing it down. I'm feeling a bit of a burn, a bit of a pump, and that's the end of the set. Versus, okay, let me also include a few sets to failure where, even if you paid me or my life depended on it, I cannot get another rep, and then use that to sort of critically assess the previous sets and know whether you're close to failure.
So that's an important distinction there, though, right? Because what you're saying is voluntarily going slow versus being forced to go slow do not achieve the same. Because people will presume that, they hear about how tension is important. So it's, okay, if I take this 10-pound dumbbell and just put as much tension in as possible and just curl it for 1 rep, box ticked, right?
Yeah. It would be nice if it was like that.
If I make it a little more nuanced and say if it's a seated leg curl, right? So you can set that up so in the start position, you're in a really stretched position. Now, when you start the rep, there's a couple of things that you could do. You could just explode into and go into that rep, or you can ease into the rep and then accelerate after you ease into the rep. One's going to create failure faster than the other, right? Because one's going to have that starting strength to be able to kind of push through that, where the other one's going to introduce, the ability to use lower loads, to be able to accomplish the same thing. So with that nuanced perspective, does that change what you're saying in any way?
Not really. If you're still ending up very closer to failure, you're still covered, because you will have to still be at that starting position. And at some point, even if you're trying your best to move it as fast as possible, it's going to slow down. If you, for some reason, like to move the weight slower because it feels better, then you, as you said, you'll get closer to failure, but you will still be maximally, I assume, you'll still be maximally trying to move the weight, so you're still at the same point. So like failure and being close to failure is a great equalizer, if that makes sense, and it's a very easy way for you to make sure that your hypertrophy training is effective, as long as you said, as long as you're not being a dumb fuck and like all of a sudden now you're YOLOing your form on the lat pull down and leaning back to a 90-degree torso angle. If you're close to failure and you've kept things relatively strict, there's very little that you're leaving on the table, if anything.
You mentioned the potential benefit of going into the stretch position. So let's say we take powerlifter, strength athlete, whatever, who's naturally very explosive, likes to use the stretch reflex on everything because it's their ace card, it's what they perform well at. Are they, when it comes to their hypertrophy work, would you encourage or bias them away from that?
Or pause.
Yeah, like, are they missing a hypertrophy stimulus by allowing that very strong stretch reflex to take over in that lengthened position? Or do you think that's not having a meaningful
The belt
effect?
squat would be a good example with that, right? Because you can dive bomb out of that belt squat, or you can sit down in there, pause for a brief second, and kind of do what I said. You're not going to explode from the onset. You're going to get it moving. Then, so that would be a good example of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's a good bet for sure. So worst case scenario, you spent an extra second pausing and keeping things stricter, or whatever you want to call it. But as far as the literature goes, we recently pre-printed a study on trained individuals where we had them do a full range of motion, where they paused in the stretch position for a second and then they went all the way up, versus partials at long muscle lengths where they just did the bottom part and still paused, and they saw the same growth over 8 weeks. And that was a study where we included multiple exercises, and they did exercises that biased the stretch, others that didn't, and overall created a very real world setting where those people trained in. And at the same time, we also got people to train to failure, and we were the ones supervising them in the lab in New York, where even the full range of motion condition was instructed to perform another rep to verify that they cannot get said rep. So that to me tells me, based on the current literature, when we compare reps at short muscle lengths versus long muscle lengths, we see that long muscle length training is better than short muscle length training. Now, in untrained individuals, partials at long muscle lengths have been shown to be slightly superior than a full range of motion, which we haven't figured out exactly why yet. And the first study to look at the concept in trained individuals was the one I just mentioned. So the fact that we didn't see any additional growth from including that shortened position shows that, hey, probably emphasizing the stretch makes sense. Logistically, I don't see what you'd be losing by pausing in that stretch for a second. And if it feels so uncomfortable that you can't do it on an exercise, it's likely not going to be the end of the world, especially if you're doing multiple exercises and you're going close to failure. Because that's what that study, in my opinion, kind of shows as well. Because when we compare exercise in isolation, in some cases we've seen that exercises that place more tension in the stretch may be better than ones that don't. But in that study, they did multiple exercises and they followed the same sort of rough guideline, the same guideline of like emphasize the stretch and go to failure, and they saw the same gains.
Have there been studies in the peak contracted position, right? So I guess the closest thing might be like an isometric in the highest contracted position at all, because over, following this stuff for forever, there's been a lot of studies on the eccentric, right? There's now studies in the stretch position. So it's like I'm waiting for the studies in the contracted position, or the top half of a curl type of position. Have there been any studies on that, or is that going to be the next thing 5 years from now, where everybody's going to be talking about you need to be using a peak contraction on all your sets? And granted, it's all going to come around to just doing full sets and reps, right? But it's fun to watch the studies and how they go through.
Yeah. So there's been a bunch of stuff comparing short muscle length training, so peak contraction essentially, to just long muscle length training. And long muscle length training, almost always, with a couple maybe of exceptions where there was no differences, will most times result in more growth. And that's the case for isometrics as well. So focusing on the peak contraction, I think I can confidently say that if you're looking to maximize growth, just doing the shortened part of the range of motion is very likely a bad idea. Doing a full range of motion where you include both and you're getting that stretch, based on our recent study, as long as you're emphasizing the stretch, because as you said at the very beginning, all that study can tell you is that in 8 weeks in trained participants, when we compared a full range of motion with the pause at the stretch versus a partial and long muscle length with a pause in the stretch, in that sort of context, growth was the same. So if you want to include the peak contraction because it feels better, or because you want to make sure that you're not missing out on anything, you can do so. Just emphasize the stretch.
That plays into my confirmation bias with the strength athletes doing the accessories through a full range of motion, because most of the heavy strength work of deadlift, block pulls, all those other things are dealing with that range of motion that really doesn't have a whole lot of hypertrophy.
Yeah, for sure.
You get what I'm saying? If it's like the board press or a pin press,
100%. I get,
deadlifts off blocks and stuff like that.
Yeah, because they're missing out on that potential hypertrophy stimulus from those, because they're used for strength. So then they have to make up for it with their accessory work.
Yes.
With that study you mentioned there, depending on how one defines volume, is it not an argument to be made there that the focusing on only the stretch free position is arguably more effective? Because I'm assuming they did the same number of reps.
Yeah, exactly.
So I've done 12 half reps versus 12 full reps. So total workload done is probably half, but I got the same hypertrophy.
Yeah, I mean,
you know what I mean? That I would look that as in half the input. It's not really half, because that's the more uncomfortable part, right? But for sake of volume, let's say half the input for the same outcome. To me, sounds pretty good.
That's how we saw it, but we got a lot of shit for it.
Well, I would see it from a different perspective, which is also people aren't going to like, is that's going to be the harder position as well. So you're going to have to use less load, right? So for a strength athlete, the less load on the less important shit is going to be a better thing, because we're still looking at accumulated systemic fatigue, take a curl done that way compared to a cheat curl. A curl done that way with a dime on each side, or a cheat curl with a plate on each side, right? I mean, one's like a bicep movement, the other one's more like a clean, a reverse grip clean from that standpoint, where people want to lift bigger stuff and stuff like that. But that's kind of how I see it from that perspective, is anything, especially dealing with, demographics in my age group that are already beat up, anything that can create the same outcome with lower loads is always going to be a better thing.
Loads would, in most cases, I think, be higher, though, because you are using half the range of motion.
Yeah, but it's the bottom part.
Yeah, but on a lat pull down, to do half reps and
I get it. Yeah, I'm thinking curls. So
with some movement.
Yeah.
But even that, like, I'd say the flexibility that you have now. So to add to your point and slightly look at it from a different perspective, even if load in some cases is higher, in some cases it may be lower depending on the exercise, but the fact that you now know that, I could just do half reps, like for elbow pain, I'm sure that for a lot of lifters, just doing this is much, much easier on their elbows than doing the full range of motion. So all of a sudden, even if you don't want to buy into long muscle length training or like partials at long muscle lengths being better, all of a sudden as a coach and as an athlete, you are like, okay, I'm going to do my accessories now. I don't want to lock out on the dumbbell chest press because I don't feel like it or it feels bad. I can just cut the reps short. Happy days. Same with deadlift or good mornings, or even, I mean, with a squat, it would be difficult. But then that's where other things, more creativity becomes available to the coach.
Oh, God. I can see the bodybuilders now, you know, the constant tension on the muscle at all times are just leaning into this shit, you know, like you can't believe.
But I mean,
like never lock out so you can keep the tension on the muscle.
I think it's funny that idea is being espoused as like new. Like every bodybuilder from every generation will always say things like go to the stretch position or lockout. I mean, I'm thinking of people like Chuck Sipes, so like his main lat movement was weighted hangs.
Well, I would see on the bench press, you know, shit, for any time that I was taught to do that for bodybuilding is you're basically, you never really want to lock it out. You want to keep the tension, you know, on there. And that can actually get to a point where it's almost half reps, you know, but it's all in that bottom position, you know, with that. And there's examples of that, I guess, Branch Warren, you know, Ronnie Coleman, Johnny, for sure. You know, so it kind of all plays into there anecdotally, you know, from that standpoint. The issue comes then for the power lifter is when you transfer over, you have to lock it out. You don't know how, because you've kind of conditioned yourself to not lock shit out. You know, so you find those guys are like here, and it's like, it's done. And part of the reason is they've never locked any of their shit out. But that's a skill now. We're not talking hypertrophy at that point. We're talking skill.
But even then, you know that even if you want to lock it out, because based on the previous literature and untrained individuals that showed that doing partials at long muscle lengths was either the same or slightly superior. But based on this study, and I would not take this study as the study, it's just one more study. So overall, the current literature still shows that doing partials at long muscle lengths will get you the same or slightly more hypertrophy than a full range of motion. But again, as a power lifter, let's say you do want to have, even from a psychological standpoint, that lockout strength in place, you can still do full range of motion and feel confident that you're not missing out on much, if anything.
So let's say that study shows that training at longer lengths is more effective for hypertrophy, right? What do you believe is the mechanism that causes that? You know, like, is it a fact that the muscle, and this might get too nerdy, I'm sorry, like, because the muscle fibers are lengthened, there's less cross bridges to work, so therefore the tension has to be higher to create the movement? Is it because there's some kind of occlusion effect and you get a little bit of blood flow restriction, you get more lactate, you know? Do you have any ideas what the actual mechanism might be that could cause that potential benefit?
It's a loaded question, and a question that we are not very close to answering now. So I would say at the moment, I would just tell you I'm not really sure. And that's what we'll eventually figure out. But the one thing that we clash with some people in our echo chamber is like, because we mentioned that we're trying to focus more on outcomes versus mechanisms specifically. Because if you're repeatedly seeing that something is causing more growth, even if you don't know exactly why that's happening, that informs our practice, because at the end of the day, we are an applied field. So we are seeing that, okay, training at long muscle lengths is better than training at short muscle lengths, and a full range of motion is the same or slightly worse than training specifically at long muscle lengths. I care about my lifters and myself and whoever else getting more muscular. Therefore, I'm happy to jump into the practical application side of it before knowing the exact mechanisms versus getting too bogged down with the mechanisms and being like, okay, is it because of this? Is it because of that? Yada, yada. Same with hypertrophy overall. If you open the curtain and go into, all right, mechanisms of hypertrophy, and you deep dive. You had Greg Knuckles here recently. So I work with Greg over at Stronger by Science, and we have been working on an article on mechanisms of hypertrophy for some time, and that's like 60 or 70 pages long. And the conclusion, obviously, there's a lot of meat and a lot of science into it, but then the conclusion is a bit like, we're not really 100% sure for a lot of things. Like, imagine hypertrophy as a big puzzle, like this whole table as a puzzle where there's pieces scattered here and there, but you don't really know exactly why everything is happening. But you know from outcome focused research that, oh, okay, training close to failure leads to more muscle growth. Yes, mechanistically you can explain most of it or part of it or whatever, but as a lifter, the mechanisms specifically are not going to be the best bet for your practice if there's outcome focused research available. For some things where there's nothing, mechanistically coming up with things may make some sense, but we've seen that many times in our field where mechanistically people were talking about deloads and saying, oh, you know, you deload every now and then, you're going to see more growth in the long term. Or what's another thing, even with periodization to an extent for hypertrophy specifically. For strength is a completely different world, but for hypertrophy there were people that have made the case of like, okay, you need to be varying this and this and that and the other, and then it doesn't pan out in the literature, even though mechanistically it has some rationale there. Same with diet breaks, where again we saw that okay, in practice those don't seem to lead to more fat loss or whatever. Same with intermittent fasting, where people said that okay, you know, you're going to be less hungry and you're going to lose more fat, yada yada yada. So I'm not a huge fan unless you are a geek who loves geeking out and learning the mechanisms for your own merit and your own education and whatever. As a lifter, focusing mostly on outcomes is your best bet, and that is the case for both hypertrophy and strength.
Okay, so I gotta pee again. So
Deloads and how they define deloads. We also did a Delphi study, which is essentially a type of study that allows you to again draw on expert opinion and provide a more official definition for deloads. But a deload is, without giving you like the verbatim definition from the papers, is supposed to be a period where you're intentionally reducing training volume and intensity or training stress in order to allow for fatigue to dissipate and for so that subsequent training can resume at a high intensity. Not to be confused with tapering, because many people use the two terms interchangeably, where they'll say, oh, I'm tapering, when they mean deload, whereas tapering, you're supposed to specifically lower fatigue. Obviously, who am I saying this to? You're supposed to lower fatigue while still keeping fitness high in order to be physically ready for a specific event. So deloads are not supposed to maximize performance, but rather to allow you to dissipate fatigue so that you can continue training. And if we look at the current literature on taking time off and that resensitizing or leading to more growth, I don't think we have anything that has shown that you will get more growth. Perhaps this is a sign that, there may be something to it. But from a hypertrophy standpoint, I'm also not a big fan of deloads. I don't think you inherently need to take a proper full deload week very often. And I think there was a bit of nocebo created around that. Granted, in strength sports and specifically competitive powerlifting, that's different. Like there are athletes that after 6 to 8 hard weeks of very heavy training and heavy arousal, they may need a very easy week of training in order to resume and have another 8 weeks in them. But from a hypertrophy standpoint, I don't think there's a whole lot of benefit in taking a deload week to resensitize growth specifically. But at the same time, taking a deload week is not going to harm your gains, so you're flexible to do so if you need to.
Well, the question I would have then would be, if the main objective of this deload is to dissipate fatigue, then why not just take the week off?
Yeah, you can.
Because isn't that going to dissipate the fatigue better than what a deload would?
Yeah. Or you can deload for less time. You know, it might take a week at 50%, or you could just take 4 days off maybe entirely and achieve the same outcome.
Yeah.
To be devil's advocate there in that study you mentioned with the 4 weeks, week off, 4 weeks, if I train for 9 weeks straight, or I can train for 4 weeks, week off, then 4 weeks and get the same hypertrophy, does that not illustrate the deload had a positive effect potentially? Because I've trained for 8 weeks rather than 9 and gotten the same thing.
Yeah, sure, if you want to see it like that, but it didn't give you more than just continuously training, because that's often the argument that you're resensitizing yourself. Granted, one study. Do I think that 4 weeks of training is enough to warrant a deload? No. Did we do our best to make training pretty hard for people? Yes. But at the same time, I'm full on the devil's advocate stance, because then you could use that for people and be like, look, you have that week off here and there because work schedule, you had to travel. Stop losing your mind over it. You are likely not going to be losing muscle gains in the long term.
True.
And then circle back to minimum effective dose. Oh, you can do a few push-ups and some other stuff here and there, like 3 sets. Do that, and you're still seeing progress.
Sure.
But where the issue is that among us, I think we're all on the same page as far as deloads go. But deloads were at some point in the context of hypertrophy presented as this, like, okay, you're going to push for 6 weeks and then you must deload to dissipate fatigue and sort of resensitize the body again. And like, if you're not doing it, you're leaving gains on the table, where that is not really supported by much.
Sure. Do you think in a longer term study, you know, like 9 weeks is not that long, especially in a hypertrophy phase, you know, how much muscle you're going to build in that time, whatever. Do you theorize that maybe if a study were done in longer continuous training periods, you may see a benefit? Like, let's say a 16-week hypertrophy phase with some kind of deload and then another phase. Do you think that that deload may warrant more merit then?
Based on the literature where people have taken time off, like legit time off, a bunch of months off, and then versus continuously training and have come back to the same place as far as gains go, no. But I cannot say that with 100% certainty. Maybe for, I don't know, even trying to make the edge case here for the like pro bodybuilder who maybe there is something to it. Like Greg Knuckles had written a really cool article titled "Grow Like a New Lifter Again?" ? If I'm not mistaken, where he looks at that literature. But the conclusion was like, yeah, there may be something to it, but it's likely not going to be anything insane. So if you're somebody who's looking to grow, if you feel fatigued and you feel absolutely destroyed, and that's another thing, if you're fatigued, your performance will go down. If you're just feeling like, oh, it's a shitty day, go to the gym, see how you're performing. If performance is there, it's likely that you're fine. But if you've noticed that performance has started regressing, you're feeling moody, you're some type of way, take an easy week of training based on what the coaches and athletes said. Even if you're doing like, do like 50% of your usual volume, leave a few more reps in reserve, and you are covered. But if you don't feel like you need that time off and you can just keep pushing, cool. And as you alluded to, naturally, there will be periods of your life where you'll naturally lower volume because you're busy or because something is going on. So all of a sudden, that Christmas period where, can I say Christmas? Where you are now like doing 3 sessions a week versus 2 sessions versus 5 sessions a week, and oh, you had to go whatever to a family dinner, so you did 2 sets versus 5 sets. That's a deload week essentially, because you're doing much less volume than before. So naturally, unless you are, and maybe this is also cultural, because a lot of people here have home gyms and have the ability to be there every day, but like, unless you are the person who can consistently train with the same volume and same intensity the whole year, there will be natural deloads built in. A good use of deloads, though, is when you know that you have something coming up. So you know you have a cruise or a holiday, and you're like, you went on holiday. I'm not sure if you trained. I assume you didn't. But like, you can look at the literature and be like, cool, 1 week off, not a big deal. Or at least push your training harder before the time off, and then be covered.
To flip that on its head then, for those who are kind of espousing for deloads like every 4 weeks for hypertrophy now, and they're saying that that's warranted, in those scenarios, is it a case they just don't really know how to program properly? Potentially, as in like they are trying to achieve too much in those 3 or 4 weeks on, which is then forcing a deload when in reality there shouldn't be a need for one. Yeah,
I think you may be freaking it if you need a week off after 4 weeks. Like, the only times where I have implemented something like that is with good friend and ex-athlete Nick, who's like currently one of the Masters 1 deadlift record holders in the UK in the IPF, who deadlifted 340 kilos. He was somebody like in the 120 kilo class, so very heavy guy, very muscular, bus driver, sedentary job, and like just a few hard sets per week were a lot for him, and he preferred to have 3 weeks on, 1 week relaxed, but he was a strength athlete, and in that case, it was a matter of preference and a specific, elite level strength individual where that worked. But from a hypertrophy standpoint, if unless you're again some freak, but like for most people, if in 4 weeks you're at the point where like you legitimately need a relaxed week of training, you're probably being a dumb fuck with your programming.
Okay. So if there isn't let's just say for argument's sake, there isn't a desensitization to training for hypertrophy, at least.
Yeah.
How do we deal with training volume for hypertrophy then? Because in a couple of recent studies, right, there almost seems to, at least within the parameters of their study, there seems to be almost a linear relationship, right, with volume and hypertrophy, right? So then that leads us to, so where is the upper limit, which they don't seem to have found in the studies at least, and do I need to forever do more volume, or the idea would be nice, right, that I resensitize so I don't have to keep doing more volume so I can, do you get what I'm trying to say?
For sure.
So where do we go with that?
So yes, we haven't found that upper threshold yet, and I think that lends itself well to those who want to absolutely make sure that they're maximizing gains and, your bodybuilder or whatever, where that tells you, hey, if you can push a muscle group at a time more, at worst, you're not going to make less gains, right? And it's an educated bet. There comes a point for some people where that extra 2%, which is not meaningful for me, is meaningful for them. And the same goes for strength. There's people that will do things that may theoretically get them a tiny bit more, but the majority of people wouldn't do. But back to the volume, like the latest meta regression by Pelland et al., shout out again to Josh and Zach and the whole team, found that yes, more equals more, but 1, diminishing returns, and 2, the certainty at which you'd actually get more from more went down after a certain point. So around like 30 to 40 fractional sets, you needed to do a whole bunch of volume to reach a level of extra muscle growth that was meaningful. And there wasn't a lot of certainty because there's not many studies that have looked at those higher volumes. But for the individual who is thinking, okay, maybe I need to vary my volume, so I'm sensitive to volume, so I don't need to do more, I think that it's a bit of a fall or like pseudo concern, because unless you're a professional dedicated to training, if you're training hard and you're training with moderately high or moderate volumes, like you're in the 10 to 20, let's say 15 to 20 fractional sets volume range, I don't think, unless you're either taking PEDs or gaining massive amounts of weight, that you will be infinitely able to add more volume to everything and reach the point where like, oh yeah, I could comfortably add sets to my quads, to my hamstrings, my calves, to this, to that, and the other. So yeah, I'd say that thinking, okay, let me lower volume so that I'm resensitized to moderate volume so I don't need to go higher to see the adaptation. I don't think that that's going to be an issue, because you are still going to see an adaptation with moderate training volumes regardless. Yes, the research may show that if you do even more, you may see more of an adaptation, but that doesn't cancel out the previous adaptation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
Would this depend upon the conditioning level of the person? Sure. So I guess to illustrate, if what we read from, the 70s and Arnold's time of competing, super high volume, training chest twice a day at 40 sets per session or whatever it was, assuming that was built up over a period of time. I guess we can use a CrossFit athlete as an example. They train 6 hours per day. So that work capacity and their conditioning, their recoverability from that slowly increases over that long period of time, then realistically it can infinitely keep increasing as long as they're recovering and hydrating and nutrition is being able to fill that. But then it becomes kind of stupid just because of the time, which to me just validates the importance of having lower volume blocks.
Yes.
To be able to pull that back down. But the question would be if they are in that position where they are able to do 40 sets per body part, they're recovering from it, they're training hard. They've got, very few people actually get to this point, by the way. Exactly. So we need to put that out there, but those very, very rare outliers would exist. Now with them, if they cut the volume just in half, right, are they going to lose muscle mass at all? In other words, do they need to actually go through a full block, you know, of slowly lowering the volume, or can they just jump into a block that's, and I know the answer hypothetically, that's just more strength based where it's going to get cut way down, because their fear is going to be they're going to lose all their gains.
Yeah, that's been something in our echo chamber a bit. That's been like, that was being said about volume, and like that you need to keep volume extremely high to maintain adaptations. Even a couple of sets per muscle group per week, a couple of hard sets. I'm not sure about easy sets, but maybe even that would be enough. But like, you're maintaining your muscle mass and going down from, let's say, I mean, as you said, not many people are able to do 40 sets hard sets on everything simultaneously. And if they are, they're either a psycho or a professional bodybuilder that like really cares about the possibility of that extra slight delt size or whatever.
Well, plus the years to be able to get to the level to be able to do that. Yeah,
exactly. Because like, but then on the back of that, if you're so advanced and so muscular, then maybe for some people that ability reduces because now they're causing more damage or something. I'm not sure. Like, but going down to lower volumes, worst case scenario, you're making less potential gains, but you're still in a net positive as far as muscle growth goes. Minimum effective dose was somewhere around 4 fractional sets per week. So that could be 2 sets of tricep push downs and 4 sets of bench press. You've hit minimum effective dose for triceps and chest, and some and maintenance volume maybe for front delts or something. So the way a lot of people had an extreme knee-jerk reaction when that 52 set study came out, where they essentially had people do progressively, they were just training quads, and they started at 24 sets and then progressively worked up to 52 sets of quad training per week, distributed in squat, leg press, and leg extension work, with an average of around 37 sets for their quads per week for the super high volume group. And what I took from that study was that, oh, okay, if you want to push more, you can make that bet for a muscle group and push more and potentially see more and not lose gains, because we've always thought, or at least some of us thought of that inverted U, where like you're pushing, and then at some point you're losing gains. But we're seeing that that's not true. And assuming that you can recover, you could theoretically push and still see more growth. But the way I see it is that things are looking really good. And that's an opinion that also the guys that did that meta regression share as well. Because for the minimalist, you know that, hey, you can do very little and make amazing gains. For the maximalist, you know that you can keep pushing, assuming that you're recovering well, and still see more growth. So things are looking good for everyone, and that moderate range is still super efficient. It's like where you're getting the most bang for your buck as far as gains and time invested goes. And that's it.
Well, it's interesting because we've seen over time, we've seen this kind of play out anecdotally and real world stuff, because it's depending upon what's trending. You'll see waves of, let's just call it HIIT training, but there's many variations if it's doll crap training or Mentor training, Dorian, whatever it's going to be, where you'll have high volume guys that will start doing that and then start bragging about the best gains that they've ever had in their life. And then the inverse, you know, you'll have people that are doing that, then they'll jump on, say, one of Meadows' programs, which is more higher volume based, and like, oh my God, this is the best gains I've ever had. I just wasted my time. Meanwhile, neither one of them realized that the main takeaway here is that they're periodizing, you know, the volume, you know, over periods of time. They just run in each for years upon years. So they both kind of work. The question would be, what would be the effectiveness of if they were both built into the same 12-week block, right? Because now you're kind of all over the map.
Yeah, like I'm not a huge fan of, for hypertrophy at least, mapping things out in blocks. Obviously, I empathize with the strength athlete side where it's going to be a hypertrophy.
Well, that's how we see the world. So I
get you there. But for the individual out there who wants to maximize hypertrophy, and that's all they care about, starting in the mid to highest range where efficiency is still high and diminishing returns haven't fully kicked in, starting there, assessing recovery capability, and then also doing a personalized assessment for which muscle groups may require more growth. That's where being critical and using all that information and piecing it together comes in place, because people look at volume recommendations and leave with the assumption that, okay, let's say 20 to 30 is the best, right? It's not, but let's say it is. There, or like it leads to the most growth. They're like, okay, so I have to apply it to everything. No, it may be that you are somebody who sees a lot of leg growth from low volumes because you're genetically blessed in the leg department, but your upper body lacks a lot relatively to your lower body. So then you can use that information to adjust training volume and be like, okay, I'm hitting above minimum effective dose for my legs. I'm going to allocate more volume to my arms, side delts, and upper chest, and then keep the rest in the mid-range volume.
And for how long, right? So if I'm taking my block view of training in general, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, is instead of having the distinctive blocks that we would look at in the strength world, you'll have a block that's going to focus on quads or whatever that weak point is. And then the next one may focus on different weak points that you want to try to bring up.
Yep.
For how long?
I'd say a good heuristic would be to look at maybe 16 plus weeks. Just so that, because like muscle growth is a slow process, and like doing an 8 to 12 week block, sure, like closer to 12 weeks may be enough to see some growth, but I'd say 16 plus. It could even be a whole year, where if you're somebody who's like a geek about hypertrophy training, or you're like, even if you're not a bodybuilder, you're somebody in a commercial gym and you're like, I really want my delts and arms to grow. It may be that for a year, you keep everything else in the low to moderate effective volume for hypertrophy, where you're still seeing growth, and then you're pushing those weaker muscle groups that are not responding as well with higher training volumes for a complete year.
That's a great takeaway, because what I see people do is like a week or 4.
Yes. Which is which
isn't going to be enough.
It's not going to be enough. And it's like, you see that with a lot of things, even with strength training as well, where somebody either gets a new coach or starts a new program and they're like swearing by it, and it's week 3. And it's like, it's week 3, bro. Like, it's not the new coach or the new program. It's probably the psychology side of things.
Just something I think is probably worth just echoing there. You mentioned a bit back. Do we have any reason to believe then that the minimum effective dose for hypertrophy changes for an individual? So like, we take one of those people who are drawn to high volume type training. Do we have any reason to believe that their minimal effective dose is going to change in response to that? Because that will usually be the defense many will use to just kind of justify the fact that maybe they're a little bit addicted to training. They just want to do more when maybe they don't have to, or maybe even to their own detriment. So do we really have any reason to believe that, oh, because I'm doing 40 partial sets a week, or fractional sets, sorry, that now my minimum effective dose has gone from 4 sets to 8 or whatever it might be?
Not really. I don't think so. I don't think you can make an insane argument, or a super solid argument for why that will change. Granted, training, like your personal minimum effective dose may be higher than mine, and you may respond differently to training volume, but I would be skeptical with somebody saying, okay, I need an insane amount of sets in order to see any progress. I would question how solid that claim is. But yes, there are people will respond differently to training, and you've all seen that with anything, high volume, high load, high whatever. Not everybody will respond the exact same to a specific volume prescription, and that's why having those ranges is useful. And that's where people get annoyed. They're like, well, where's the specific answer? How many sets should I do? 10 to 20 is a big range. There are people out there that may not see as much of they may not be great responders. And that's the thing with studies as well. When you look at averages, there are people out there that will go through a training study and won't grow much, and the average, and others will grow a lot. So therefore the average of the group that did whatever intervention is a net positive, but within that study, some people may have not seen so many gains. But using those those set ranges, and then committing to training and critically evaluating whether you're seeing a response, is ultimately the name of the game, which is even less sexy than do the basics. But if you feel, let's say if you feel that you're a non-responder, or that you're not going to respond much to the minimum effective dose, cool, and you have the time for it, you can be in that moderate volume range. In worst case scenario, you're doing a bit more even though you didn't need to.
My question would be then, with related to the volume, when we're seeing these studies that are doing the real high-end volumes, right? In your opinion, do you think over the long term it would probably end up being very similar? And the reason I ask that is, if someone's doing 40 fractional sets for a body part or whatever, they probably can't do that forever. So at some point, they're probably going to have to deload in some way, even for joint wear or tear or boredom or, you know, whatever it might be. They're fed up of doing leg extensions or whatever. So if we map that out over long enough, like a year or 2 years, do you think the disappointing answer would probably be that by the time you take all those variables into account, they probably all end up doing the same thing or very similar, providing we're hitting that minimal dose or that suggested range that you mentioned? Maybe.
And it may also be that you, with higher volumes, you see more of a response in the short term, and then in the long term, things plateau regardless. I cannot tell you for sure, but then that's where context is important. We are people that have based our life, and I'm not going to get philosophical or talk about life and where we'll be in 200 years. We've based it around training for muscle mass and strength beyond what's needed for quality of life or being capable. So it's like you have a limited amount of time where you can test stuff and have fun with training. And if you're seeing that, okay, more will lead to more, yes, it may be that if you continuously train for 20 years, even if you have a lower sort of weekly training volume, you just get there slower. It's still worth trying. Does that make sense?
Yes.
We don't know the answer. I would love when we become millionaires, so it's manifesting here, I will pour a lot of money back into research, and I want to specifically have like a year-long study where we pay people to commit to it, and we test those things and see, okay, over a year or even longer, do things sort of reach the same point, and it's all about just lifting consistently with intensity of effort and doing enough, or do these things actually make a big difference in the long term?
Sure. Because the reason I ask that is because we see this in the strength world, right? Like the quintessential example would be something like Smolov. You know, if you did a study where it's like, this group squat once a week, traditional kind of periodization approach. This group does Smolov for, 12 or 16 weeks, however long the program is. Then you're like, oh, well, based on this, squatting 3 days a week for X amount of volume is the best way to grow your squat. Whereas if you map them out over long enough and you take into account the fact they'll have to deload, they'll come out of that peaking phase, and then they probably have to build. In a year's time, they probably gain a similar amount, overall, and I wonder if we then see the same with hypertrophy, like maybe in the short term, those higher volumes help. I'm not sure how long the studies were, I'm sorry, but maybe they burn out quicker for want of a better way of putting it. And then we have to end up, kind of toning things down just for wear and tear and recovery. So we all kind of end up in the same place anyway.
Hey, maybe I do. And that's where, there's a recommendation that people give, and they say, like, they'll tell people, just lift, bro, don't overthink it. And on one hand, it's a shitty piece of advice for a beginner, because just lift then leads to a variety of questions: how many reps, how many sets, when, what. But for a lot of people that have that basic knowledge, and especially those that are science-based and like will bust balls with like mental gymnastics and constantly wondering about, what about if I twist my finger slightly? And it's like, what we are seeing from the literature is that as long as you're consistently training hard and you're not being an absolute dickhead with what you're doing and you're ticking basic boxes, just lifting will get you a lot. If not, it will get you the majority of your gains and get you maybe close to like 80-90% of potential gains for strength and hypertrophy. Sure. So it may be that in 20 years we do figure out that 5 or 10 basic boxes, and then it's just keep doing it.
What about training frequency then? Because I believe you've worked with Schoenfeld. He's got some good studies looking at training frequency and hypertrophy. that's a question a lot of people will come to. And even now, a lot of people who train for hypertrophy think there's like a mythical training split that will be the ultimate answer to getting them the 5 pounds they don't have. So within the research, what are we seeing in terms of training frequency? First for hypertrophy, but then obviously we can talk about strength and so on from there as well.
Yeah, for hypertrophy, it doesn't seem to play much of a role, like a huge role, as people believed back in the day. But again, evidence-based, science says, it's probably not a huge deal. But then from experience and in practice, training a muscle a few times per week may allow you to allocate a bit more volume to it, or allow you to train it with a bit more intensity of effort, yada, yada, yada. So my practical takeaway for people listening is, I would, if you have the time and you can schedule it, which for most people you should with semi-intelligent programming, train most things twice a week, just so you don't have to cram everything in one session, especially if you're trying to maximize growth. Now, if you like bro splits, but even then, that's another thing that sort of grinds my gears with bro splits, where people call bro splits low frequency, and that's the case for some muscle groups, but for others like triceps, those get hit multiple times per week, and maybe the same for front delts and biceps. For strength, there does seem to be some effect on frequency, where doing things a bit more frequently may give you a bit of an edge, but it's not as clear cut or as significant as some people may assume, which I think we see in practice as well. You know, some level of frequency, but then also you get your, golden era squat every 14 days, heavy squat once in a while, and those people also made gains. But then terms and conditions, genetic freaks, PEDs, yada yada yada.
So do you think training frequency becomes more important for individuals who want to train with higher volumes? So like, we take the 30 fractional sets, let's say it's quads. How many people are going to be making a decent effort by the end of a 30 set quad session? Do you know what I mean? Like, realistically, you're drained probably by set 15 or whatever. So are those 15 work sets that come at the back end of that workout really effective? Are they doing anything? And is that where the frequency comes in then, in your opinion? The fact that if we took those 15 sets and put them 2 days later, the effort, the concentration, so on and so forth, is probably better applied to them?
Yeah, probably. But that's where, again, your practice, like, and again, people don't like to hear it, but that's where you as a lifter, as a coach, that's where you have to make that decision based on what you're experiencing or what your athlete is experiencing. So if the feedback is, I was drained, my session RPE was maxed out, this was the most difficult session I did, and then you see video footage of those last sets and it's like somebody just mindlessly forcing leg extensions, yes, you could go, yes, but the literature says there's no difference, and just go with that. Or you could say, okay, bro, yeah, that looked like a bit of a shitty fatigue-inducing YOLO session. We're going to split things into.
So do you think in most cases then, for someone who's interested in hypertrophy, the split is probably considerably less important of a variable to consider over exercise selection, volume, intensity? Those are the variables that probably make up more of the determining hypertrophy or outcomes or whatever that come from it.
Yes, but at the same time, if you're not committing to it, if you're not able to do it long term and you're not sticking to it, that will inherently be more important than all those together. So yes and no, in the sense that if the split is the ideal split on paper, but you're not committing to it, then doing something more suboptimal on paper that you can commit to it long term is likely going to be better than the optimal thing on paper. But yes, frequency I would rank less on a pyramid in terms of importance versus intensity of effort, for sure. Like you could do everything in one session and still make top gains, but you can't be half-assing your sets and make top gains from a muscle growth perspective. Volume seems to be pretty important as well. Like, if you're Mike mentoring it and doing the odd set here and there and taking a week between your 2 sets of bicep curls, will you still make some gains? Maybe, probably, but doing 8 sets will for sure give you more than that. So yeah, I wouldn't lose my mind over with frequency, but I wouldn't take this study said this, therefore that's all we're going to run with.
Well, I'd have to think exercise selection is going to have to play some role, because the fatigue that's going to be induced with the leg extensions is going to be completely different than squats. A standing leg curl is going to be completely different than RDL, or the abduction adduction machine. You can do 20 sets of legs and do a fucking adduction, in or out, and train hard on that because there's not a lot of demands on that. So when you're looking at that total volume, some of those things need to be considered because those, some would call junk sets or whatever it's going to be, they're not going to have that same impact of other movements that are bigger in that regard. So when you're talking total volume, how's that kind of get worked into the equation?
I'd say a good way to view exercise selection as a very basic overview would be to have like different movement patterns and also include at least one multi-joint and one single joint exercise for every muscle group. Because like with the classic, it's a squat, brother. If you squat 500, I cannot do the accent, but if you squat 500, your legs are going to be huge. Sure. And if you work 16 hours a day, you're going to make a lot of money, but is there a better way to get there? But like when we've looked at things like exercise selection for the quads, including a single joint exercise like a leg extension, will give you a bit of an edge as far as quad growth goes. So including both makes sense, and it's an easy way to ensure that you're ticking all boxes. Now you can get even deeper into things and then look at the literature on specific muscles where there's not a lot, but for example, when comparing a seated calf raise to a straight leg calf raise, the straight leg calf raise was far superior for the majority of the calf musculature than the seated one. But again, if you are ensuring that every muscle group gets 2 to 3 exercises and there's at least one multi-joint one and one single joint one, you are likely covered, except maybe that one muscle group. But if you're that invested in that one muscle group, chances are you'll do some reading and come across the 50,000 videos there are on exercise selection.
Sure. So are you taking like neurological fatigue into account then when you're looking at a prone? So to kind of go with Dave's question, a 30 partial set quad workout, if 10 or 12 of those sets are squats, yoke bar squats, that's a lot more draining than if those 12 sets are leg press or belt squat or leg extension, for example. In your head, how do you approach a training program looking at that side of things? Obviously, one is more neurologically demanding than the other,
Yeah, for sure. But these are things that we've observed, and I think our observations hold some merit. So for things like RDLs, I will be less inclined to prescribe very high volumes in a single session for exercise like squats and RDLs. Is it because of CNS fatigue per se? Not really, because then it's a big discussion and a complicated discussion of what that actually means. But is it a case of, okay, you're working multiple muscle groups, you are also, when you're squatting and deadlifting, you're also working your erectors, you're working your glutes, yada yada yada. So yes, that's for sure taken in consideration. But if you look at my programming, things are relatively simple. On paper, there's no single muscle group unless explicitly stated by the individual that they, it's a weak point and they can really handle a lot of volume, that I do more than 5 sets per session for that muscle group. So for that exercise, excuse me, most exercises will be somewhere in the 2 to 5 set range, which I think is a good overall heuristic. Will there be exceptions? Sure.
So in this,
before you jump into that, when you say 2 to 5 sets, are those working sets? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Always. And with warm-ups and hypertrophy, I think warm-ups are way overthought for hypertrophy.
Yeah.
Just, you can literally go into it straight up. I wouldn't suggest that for squats and skill-based exercises, but like if you told me now you have 10 minutes to work out, I can bang out 8 working sets on a few things and I'll be fine. It will be lat pull downs and push-ups, but still I'm not going to be warming up for those.
Yeah.
So in this realm now of training volume not making as much of a difference perhaps as we thought, effective reps and all that, where do intensification techniques fall into that? So drop sets, supersets, myo reps, all these types of things, what role do they play then in the hypertrophy stimulus versus the volume that they take up and so on?
Sure. So what we're seeing, we're not seeing what we thought we'd see, maybe from back in the day, where supersets and drop sets would be presented as like plateau busters or thickness build, like these buzzwords that there would be a T Nation article and then people would quote that and then they would make videos on it and then it would become sort of common knowledge when it wasn't like a common truth. I'm yapping a lot, but from the literature, as far as supersets go, especially agonist, antagonist supersets, are an amazing way to save time while seeing the same growth. So, and that's what I incorporate quite a bit, both with clients and with myself. So banging out, like now, if you told me 10 minutes to train, I think I'm constantly reducing that hypothetical there. You told me 30 seconds to train. So if you gave me 10 minutes to train, doing a lat pull down back to back with a push-up will allow me to get, in the study that we recently did, people managed to get the same gains in 40% less time spent training. Same with drop sets. They can be a really good way to reduce the time taken to train, which in theory, over time, if you're able to be a bit more time efficient and get enough training volume in, you could in theory see better gains than if you were just doing traditional training and you were doing less volume because you had less time.
Well, one's different than the other with those two examples, because one is, two opposing muscle groups, for time, where the drop set would be the extension of a set that was already a failure, such as how a myo rep would be, or force reps, or whatever you want to do that's taken that one set past failure. So what's the research kind of saying on that? Because let's say if it's myo reps and we're talking effective reps, how many reps close to failure, or if I do one set to failure and take 10 deep breaths, then knock out 3 more reps, am I, if I need 6 total sets in that effective rep range, am I getting those with each one of those myo reps or rest pause or whatever you want to call that at that time in that one movement? Or does that negate because the failure was already achieved once to begin with?
Yeah, so with myo reps, it was a similar takeaway where you were again being much more time efficient because you were able to squeeze in more volume by doing those effective reps. But in terms of intensifiers leading to more growth, we haven't seen that. If you compare 2 training protocols, because like in research, in order to isolate that variable, you have to match for volume. So in a real world scenario where you're not matching for volume, myo reps or supersets or drop sets could lead to more gains simply because they are able to get more volume in because they're being more time efficient. And that's where the real magic may lie in these advanced techniques versus, you're intensifying the sets and that creates some sort of magical growth environment versus doing the exact same amount of work just with bigger breaks.
So then where would a pre-exhaust set come in?
It would come in for I'm trying to think of a joke. I can't come up with anything. But with pre-exhaust, it was we also saw no difference. Not we didn't conduct the research, but from the literature, there doesn't seem to be a big difference as far as, or any difference as far as gains go. It can be a good way, I guess, for some people to use less load on compound movements, maybe because of injury, and maybe they don't want to go light and super high rep and they want to go 5 to 10 reps on a squat, and they've done a bunch of leg extensions before, so now they can handle less weight, and that allows them to not have to be there and squat for 30 reps.
Well, if it was pre-exhausting your triceps, say before a seated chest press, is that going to stress the pecs more because the triceps are fatigued?
In theory, yes, but it doesn't seem to lead to more growth off the pecs because you are still going close to failure with your pecs regardless.
Okay.
Like if you're taking the set to the point where you're like here, your pecs, your triceps, everything is at its limit.
Sure. So if we go like Dave's example, then if we use the currency of effective reps, because that makes life easy to understand, right? He does his drops. Let's say he does his initial set of 10 reps. That is to failure. So let's say he gets 5. He could do another work set of 10 and get another 5, or he could do a drop set where he drops the load by 20%, rests 20 seconds, and gets 5. And if that 5 is close to failure, or what, those 5 probably are all effective. So now he's gotten 10 in one set, in theory, as opposed to having to do 2 sets to get them. That's kind of it in a nutshell?
Yeah, more or less. But then you can also briefly look at the rest period literature, where resting very little is not the end of the world, but may get you less gains in the long term. But again, if you're using those sort of techniques to get more volume in less time, you are likely not leaving any gains on the table and maybe making more gains if you're time pressed.
Yeah, sure.
Speaking of time, I had booked to go see West Side Barbell at 2.
Yep.
But I'm not going to make it from the... Is there a way to contact them and tell them?
I love what you guys are talking about, because it's basically, you know, with the mile reps and the stuff like that, time economy. I don't have the same desire to be able to train that I did, say, 20 years ago, except for like the squat on the weekends when I have more time. So during the week, exactly as what you said, I can, if I have 10 minutes or 15 minutes, I'll take care of my cardio needs, because I'm old as fuck now, and that's probably more important than what the other needs are. But then I can train, as you were saying, you know, opposing muscle groups, you know, myo reps, and you'd be surprised at how many boxes you can check, especially if you're using a machine that you don't need a lot of warm-up sets for. I can check a lot of fucking boxes in 15 minutes.
Yes.
Almost to the point where it's like, did I even do anything? You know, but, and I think that plays a role when we, to circle it all back to that strength athlete that needs to put that hypertrophy in the most time efficient manner, that's not going to pull away from the big things. I think they overthink shit way too much. Like one set of triceps using myo reps or whatever it is can check a lot of boxes, instead of I need to do, you know, oh God, I mean, we'll get in. I need to do something for the outer head. I need to do something for the inner head. I need to make sure I get 6 sets for each one. It's like, dude, and they don't understand the fractional stuff and all these other things that we're putting into this, where if the main goal of that is just the hypertrophy, that can be checked pretty fucking easy.
Pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And I think that then bleeds into the problem you see, though, because if they had the correct perception that, you know, 1 myo rep set for front delt, triceps, biceps, whatever, at the end of your bench session was enough, you could probably convince them to do it year round, which means they probably do enough work over the year to actually grow.
Yeah.
Whereas because they have this perception that it needs to be 4 work sets on 5 or 6 different movements, they only can make themselves do it for a month or 2.
Yep.
And then it all gets dropped out because now I'm prepping or whatever. Exactly. Whereas, as you've kind of espoused to, even if you want to do triple, quadruple the minimum effective dose, the amount of extra hypertrophy it actually gets you in that time frame is probably really low. So if you're only committing to doing double the minimum effective dose for 2 months, you're still not actually really gaining anything significant, right? Whereas if you could commit to the minimum effective dose for 10 months of the year, you know, maybe taking it out a month before 2 meets, they'd probably be way better off, I'd presume. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that's a big thing that I tell powerlifters and strength interested individuals, that the 8-week hypertrophy block you did, okay, great, but you could keep, and it's the same with heavier specific powerlifting work as well. Like, you can keep that in the entirety of the year. So let's say you have a year where you're trying to get bigger and you're doing a lot of hypertrophy and like accessory work, or even derivatives of SBD. You could still do the couple of singles at RPE 6 and maintain your 1 RM, or just be relatively fresh as far as specific comp lifts go. And the same goes with hypertrophy, where even if you have a competitive year where you're doing a lot of powerlifting specific training, keeping those few sets here and there, obviously maybe not 4 weeks out or whatever, like, you can do it. It's not going to be so much fatiguing. It's not going to require a lot of time, and it will keep things ticking along as far as hypertrophy goes without much a real effort. If you're a power lifter who squats heavy and who deadlifts heavy, the 3 extra sets you're doing on chest press and whatever chest support machine row, like, that's just fun time, you know, even if they're hard sets close to failure, you know.
So if you have the any type of strength athlete, albeit bodybuilder, power lifter, strongman or just more than general strength enthusiast, somebody that really cares about their training. And they've gotten to, I hate to use the term, but I don't know how else to really define that, very close to where their genetic potential is. PEDs or not PEDs, they're still going to hit this kind of like upper threshold. Then what advice would you have for them to be able to maintain the longevity of in that state and then being able to actually break plateau? Because things change when you get to that point.
Yeah.
Right. They change a lot. But once they're there, you know, the key thing is how long to stay there. And then the nuance to that would be what things can be manipulated to be able to try to push that envelope a little more than to, because nobody's going to really hit their full genetic potential. It's, let's say 90%, 95% ish, but there is some variance, you know, to be able to play around in there. But they can't do that if they don't last longer after they getting there is not really, I don't want to say it's not that hard, but getting there for anybody that's consistent, that takes care of the big rocks, can get there faster than what they really think. Once they're there, it becomes very nuanced. But before that nuance can even hit, you got to last long enough to be able to milk the nuance that you're going to have in there. So what advice would you have for them?
I'm trying to make a that's what she said joke, but she said it and then broke up with me. No, I'm joking. Shout out to my wife. So joking aside and throwing myself completely off to make that shitty joke aside, I'd say that that's where the concept of the minimum effect, the concept, and it's not like a method, the minimum dose method. It's a concept that I think people should utilize more in order to have that longevity and avoid having those periods where they're forcing volume or forcing a lot of hard sets and potentially experiencing more injuries or pains or aches or burnout. So starting lower and being a bit more conservative with how they progress things in terms of overall volume, as well as intensity of effort, meaning proximity to failure, I think that can be key. So instead of going, okay, I'm a power lifter, I'm an elite lifter, close to my genetic potential or right there, instead of going, okay, I need to make sure I'm going to make progress and let me blast training volume and let me do things to the max, taking a deep breath and going, okay, let's see what's the most I can get from the least I can do, if that makes sense. And then being a bit more disciplined and less fearful, less a bit less risk averse, if that makes sense, and trying to get more with less, because that may allow you to train for more time and eventually last longer in the sport. The other thing that is not training related is controlling external variables like stress and work. Especially if those are off the charts, that's where the concept of the minimum effective dose comes in place. But if you have a chance to lower your outside stress, that could be huge. An anecdote that was shared with me was from Taylor Atwood's coach when we were talking about, I don't remember what we were talking about, but he was talking about Taylor's best training period. And he specifically mentioned that it was during COVID, because everything had shut down. And even though the program didn't change much, and if anything, it may have been a bit more basic or a bit more suboptimal on paper, simply because things had slowed down so much during the first lockdowns and stress had gone down because work and travel was down, that immediately resulted in better training, less aches, and yada, yada, yada. So yeah, I'd say being a bit more conservative can pay, in my opinion, right? Because we don't have any data on that, can pay dividends long term versus fearing that, but what if I waste those 4 weeks now and I don't do 20 sets of squats per week? Like, do 6 sets and then see, okay, have some sort of metric within your training, maybe a single or some heavier work where you can use it to either estimate your 1RM or see where you're at, and then see whether that's increasing and then adjust from there.
Sure. I want to ask you about a paper. I think it's a singular paper that's kind of doing the rounds right now, which is that we no longer need a calorie surplus to grow muscle.
You've been following a certain someone on Instagram.
Well, I've got to have ammunition to throw you, right? So, so apparently now we don't need a calorie surplus to grow muscle, which, it may be true in some cases, maybe not. But again, if we're looking at like getting actually jacked long term, then that probably changes things, right? So what's your interpretation of that paper that's going around?
Yeah, so first of all, I think the paper you're referring to is the Helms et al. Study, where they essentially had 3 groups, 1 at maintenance and then 2 at different surpluses, but they both ended up it was a 5% and a 15% surplus, but they both ended up being in a somewhat 15% surplus. But that was a study with a small amount of, like a small sample size because of COVID-19. So it messed up their projections as far as participants went a bit. But what they saw is that they saw similar gains from maintenance and a surplus in a relatively short period of time. And they saw that the more weight you gained, the more fat mass you gained, not necessarily more muscle, but there were some limitations with the volume allocated to some muscle groups like the biceps, yada, yada, yada. Really cool study, and a study that does hint at the possibility of like, even at maintenance, you can still make really solid gains. However, there's a paper by Slater et al. Where they look at whether an energy surplus is required to maximize muscle growth, and there are variables that go into building muscle that may be a bit more energy costly than some assume, but nowhere near what the old school crowd of you got to eat big to get big thought. That said, it may be true, and we don't have enough studies at the moment on bulking, especially controlled studies in the way we view bulking, where 16 weeks of hard training, controlled bulk, same protein intake, multiple individuals, yada, yada, yada. We don't have many of those. And we have studies that looked at other things that we're drawing inferences from, etc. But if you are somebody who's spending a lot of time in the gym and wants to get really strong and grow muscle, being on a very conservative surplus, IMO is a solid, educated bet until we definitely know that, you don't need to be in a surplus to gain muscle, because you are essentially minimizing fat gain. Sure, you may gain 3 kilos, 5 pounds of fat, whatever, over a specific period of time. But at the same time, you are ensuring that you are in an anabolic enough environment for it to be conducive to muscle growth, versus potentially risking that not being the case. So the downside there, to me, there's definitely a downside to going YOLO and saying, I'll eat 3 pizzas a day and gain as much weight as humanly possible, hoping that will get me more muscle. But going, there's a potential question mark next to a surplus being necessary for maximizing muscle growth. Therefore, I will now never be in a surplus, and that's how I'm going to maximize muscle growth. I think the potential trade-off there is not that favorable, because, being in a 5% surplus and slowly gaining over the course of a year, let's say, 10 pounds, sure, you may have 5 pounds to lose. Some of that weight will be food in your stomach. You'll retain water because you're eating more carbs, some muscle, some fat, yada, yada, yada. So it's like, okay, is the idea of having to diet for a month that big of an issue, versus potentially risking making less gains for something that is your hobby and you're dedicating a shit ton of time, mental and physical energy to? In my opinion, I tell most people, hey, take it very slow, slight surplus, make sure the scale is slowly going up over time, measure your waist circumference so that you know that your visceral adiposity is in check, stay physically active outside the gym, hit your 6 to 10,000 steps a day, lift intensely, and you're likely maximizing muscle growth.
Can one have too much body fat to optimize hypertrophy?
Based on the literature, no, and anecdotally, no as well. I'm sure you've worked with individuals that were, chonkers, and they were kept growing. But like even here in the US, with American football, you have people that continuously grow. Plus, the literature doesn't show that more body fat leads to less hypertrophy adaptations, which anecdotally also checks out. Another thing I'd like to note, though, is that in the literature, the most muscular individuals also have pretty high body fat percentages when it comes to like they did a case study on Ray Williams. And I think he had the highest amount of like either lean body mass or something recorded in the literature. And in general, you do see more muscle mass in individuals with higher body fat percentages in strength sports. And that's why weight categories exist. But then another point that I'd like to raise, and this is just for discussion's sake, is that we don't really know exactly why weight gain leads to more strength in some cases, because it's not just leverages. Like it's not only that if I now gain 20 kilos, I guarantee you that my squat will skyrocket because it makes the lift so much more efficient, but everything else will as well. And whoever goes on a bulk sees huge strength increases as well. So there's something around weight gain and strength that we haven't figured it out. There's a student doing his PhD on that topic and he might have something to share, but I wouldn't completely push a surplus away simply because we don't have enough data to justify a minor surplus. I would just keep things super tidy.
Could the weight gain and strength increase be down to passive stability, in your opinion? So like your body fat goes up, you're in a high surplus, all of a sudden your glycogen's full, you've got more water, you've maybe got more intramuscular triglycerides, you actually have more fat sat around the joint. Mm-hmm. It's easier to imagine with the shoulder, obviously, because it's so unstable and moves so much. All of that's going to have some passive stability to it. It might be inconsequential, it might not, but we can probably assume that it does some help, because I mean, we've all had a bench session, right, where let's say we've undereaten for the week, you come in low on glycogen, low on water, dehydrated, whatever, and your bench feels like absolute trash. And then you compare that to, the night before you eat a whole pizza on your own and then you go in and bench in the morning, all of a sudden you feel like Superman. Like you didn't gain muscle in that week or that day, exactly. Right? But you did change your glycogen and your water storage mechanism. So I wonder if that, obviously I imagine there's a top end to that though, as in like if you're already 300, I can't imagine being 330 maybe is going to give you those benefits again.
Yeah. I honestly don't know, but like on one hand people will say, or Arnold used to say, fat doesn't move weight or doesn't contract or is not a muscle, but at the same time we are looking at people based on their weight class and not allowing for bigger individuals. Yeah, more muscle, but at the same time, why do those who have more fat have also more muscle? Is it because they would have more muscle anyways, or is there maybe something to gaining weight and engaging in resistance training that leads to more strength? That's outside of muscle growth now. But there's still whoever speaks about bulking in absolutes and it's definitely not needed. And by bulking I mean being in a very slight surplus and gaining some weight moderately over time. They're being way too absolute or way too certain on the data.
So you mentioned kind of back at the beginning of this that it's unclear how much muscle mass or gaining muscle mass helps with strength. And then obviously you've also mentioned that weight gain seems to help. We don't really know why. So if those things aren't having huge effects, right, what are the mechanisms that actually allow us to be stronger?
That's another kind of worms that
I mean, if it's not, if muscle gain is here or there, maybe like what's going on at a neurological level or with some other structures that actually allow me to squat 450 when I could only squat 400 3 months ago or whatever.
It's a whole, like, again, as you're looking at a huge map, a huge puzzle. Greg Nuckols has done a top article on exactly that, trying to map out all the different mechanisms, but still you have a question mark, because strength is not just muscle mass, because you see that clearly you see that okay, more muscle doesn't always result in more strength, but at the same time if you're trying to map out powerlifting data and look at the effect of weight gain on strength, you do see a positive influence there. So with strength, and like when we say strength, we all know what we mean, but for us it means strength on specific movements for specific rep ranges with specific equipment. So there's a skill component, central nervous system component, and neurological component. But at the same time, there's a question mark on the muscle mass. So that's where, again, I would go, we don't know for sure. That's why we focus on the outcomes and see, okay, I need to lift heavy. I need to maybe train a bit more frequently. I need to be specific to the task that I want to get stronger in. And it's a solid idea to potentially gain more muscle as well.
Sure.
That makes sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because, you know, I like to look at maybe like Olympic weightlifters in this example, because they tend to have much more streamlined training than powerlifters or bodybuilders, etc. And, you know, we can see very clearly that, you know, with the correct training and very streamlined training, huge loads can be moved with not a huge amount of muscle mass. You know, there are some Olympic lifters squatting high bar with Olympic bars, some insane weights, and squat isn't even a competition lift for them. And if they don't have the muscle mass that we'd expect to see from that, so there's got to be a big neurological or some other component there that is being developed perhaps better with their style of training, who knows, that, you know, is going to be a big part of that strength equation for people who want that.
Yeah, it's also something that I think people miss. There's a bit of a misconception when like people look at bodybuilders and then look at either weightlifters or powerlifters and assume that bodybuilders are that more muscular, when in reality it may be that they appear more muscular because they're leaner and they've focused on muscle groups that allow you to get a more muscular look. Because if you look at I think studies comparing the lean body mass of powerlifters and powerlifters are jacked, are pretty jacked. It's just that if you're not really blasting your side delts and your lats as much as a bodybuilder, you can appear smaller. And especially if you're natural and you're wearing clothes most of the time, you may be as muscular, if not more muscular, especially quads, hamstrings, erectors, upper back, triceps, pecs. But then all of a sudden your arms look smaller because you're not blasting your biceps. That may also affect your forearms. That may also affect your lats, side delts, yada, yada. Therefore, you look less muscular because you also don't know how to pose and you don't post as much, as many pictures. And all of a sudden there's this narrative that bodybuilders are so much more muscular than powerlifters. Therefore, muscle mass may not play as much of a role. But I would just say that they're more muscular in certain areas, but in other areas, powerlifters are likely more jacked.
They're carrying more body fat too.
They're carrying more body fat.
So visually, they're not going to look as jacked.
Exactly. Like you take, what would be even if you take Ray Williams, right? Take a picture of Ray Williams in a t-shirt and then a picture of C-Bum or whoever. You show it to the average gym goer and they're like, okay, no offense. All right, some fatso and wow.
Yeah, now put them both in a hoodie and take a picture of them from behind.
Yeah.
You know,
or measure their muscle mass and all of a sudden, oh, this guy has, I don't know if it's double, but a lot more. But the same goes with like natural lifters in like lower weight classes. Like they're pretty lean and pretty jacked, and compared to some natural bodybuilders and similar off-season body weights, I'd say powerlifters could be more jacked as well. Bit of a tangent.
Yeah,
no, sure. You mentioned earlier that deloads for hypertrophy probably don't have a role, but you mentioned a couple of times that deloads for strength are a different animal and for performance. So how is it different, and how should those be approached then if those do have a role? And let's say it's outside of tapering for a competition in this context.
So yeah, for sure. Tapering is its own thing. It's part of meet prep. It's part of a competition prep. But for strength specifically, and for powerlifters specifically, there may be a merit to actually deloading so that you can mitigate fatigue in order to be able to express the skill and to maximize force production more than a bodybuilder or a hypertrophy enthusiast cares about. And at the same time, there's an argument to be made for the psychological arousal that comes with very intense powerlifting training, but as well the heavy loads that are being used and potentially some neuromuscular fatigue, although question mark next to that. So I'd say that for powerlifters, I wouldn't say that, force a deload if you don't need it, but in the grand scheme of things, a week of reduced training where you can still make progress towards your goal, because proximity to failure and strength have a different relationship than proximity to failure and hypertrophy. All of a sudden, the deload for a powerlifter can still be a very productive week of training where they're lowering fatigue, but they haven't stopped progressing towards their goal, because all of a sudden now you come in and instead of doing as much volume, you do 2-3 sets per movement per week, you know that you're hitting minimum effective dose. You're leaving 4 to 5 reps in reserve. That's not really fatiguing. Plus, you're doing much less volume. And you know that even those sets that are not as hard are still contributing to your strength. I'm drawing lines here like a madman. But for a hypertrophy oriented individual, an easy week of training is not detrimental to their gains, but it's not pushing their training forward or pushing that adaptation forward.
So you said neuromuscular fatigue ?
Yes.
Explain.
Yeah. So it's a thing we all feel and we felt, and I know what it feels like. And it's like, I love the feeling where you're like, okay, I've been hit by a truck today and I am destroyed after the one rep I did on that one deadlift, because I went balls to wall, super, super hyped. But people like to throw out the word, my CNS is fried. I'm like neurological fatigue. It's just being used sometimes as a bit of a buzzword and a fear-mongering thing, where back in the day, heavy work or like heavy singles or like heavy sets were left for maybe the final few weeks of comp, and it was like you got to take 14 days away from your last deadlift until your comp, and that was like a set rule. But then you'd see that when frequent singles became more of a thing and frequent heavy training became more of a thing, then that wasn't that much of an issue. So there may be a nocebo effect. There's definitely neuromuscular fatigue, but how much, when it becomes an issue or how you can minimize it, I don't think it's as simple as like, oh, okay, don't train super heavy so you don't have it. It may be more with psychological arousal, it may be more person dependent or movement dependent, but I think there's still things to be learned from there. Like take small as an example, or squat every day. Where it's like, okay, you're squatting every day and people have seen lots of success. If it was such a big issue, is it just that, oh, they're getting used to it and now it was just a matter of getting used to it, or what's going on there?
How much in that example, the squat every day scenario, how much of it do you think is down to the psychological stress? So for example, you take someone squat, maxing out on a squat, if you do it twice a year, is probably really freaking scary. You know, it stresses you out. You're probably late thinking about it all week when you've got it at the weekend or whatever. Someone maxes out, and I assume we're talking training max, not nosebleed inducing max.
Yeah, for sure.
You get someone who does that every day for 2 months, all of a sudden going in and maxing out the squat becomes like brushing their teeth a little bit. How much do you think that psychological element plays into neuromuscular fatigue?
I think it likely has an effect, although I can't pinpoint how much of an effect. But from my own experience now, to go against my own point, I love overhead pressing, and I overhead press near max 5 to 6 times per week. And I could probably overhead press here, jet lagged, and it would still be fine. You have me deadlift now, it will be a train wreck. If I go all out or very close to a heavy single in 1 week for the deadlift or for the squat, that has a completely different effect. Now, it may be that I just need to force it for a bunch of time and then all of a sudden it's easy. And I have one friend in particular who deadlifts every day, non-stop, and deadlifts over 300 kilos and does like partials, like behind the back deadlifts and block deadlifts with 400 kilos. And that's his thing, but he doesn't do anything else. And that's totally fine. So it may be a case of getting used to it. But yeah, I think the psychological arousal will definitely play a role for a short period of time, but it may be that after a while, because you're used to it, there's not much arousal. So yeah, when it's an event and you come here in the gym and there's 4 people that will spot you, that will load the bar for you, and it's like you are going in dark places in your mind, then yeah, that is likely much more fatiguing than just, daily max, whatever. But yeah, lots of questions and answers that I...
So with deloading for strength training outside of tapering, what barometers or markers are you using to determine if that's warranted? And then how do you kind of judge how much of a deload is needed based on those markers?
Sure. I like to... So frequent feedback from athletes is important to me. So like daily communication and having an idea of how they feel, but more importantly, looking at session RPE. So how hard is each session, and even more importantly, actual performance. So it's like, okay, has performance gone down? If you see that it's starting to go down and you triangulate the feedback in session RPE, and session RPE is super high, feedback is I feel like shit, and you also see that, okay, things have been looking meh for an entire week, then it's likely time for a deload, and it's likely not going to be the end of the world even if it wasn't really time for a deload. But just going based off a couple of sessions, I've seen that repeatedly, and that's just my own observation, where somebody says, oh yeah, I feel like shit, and this moved like shit, and yada yada yada, and they get in their head, and you're like, okay, let's wait until the end of the week. Obviously I'm here every day, let me know if something goes wrong and we'll adjust. And then all of a sudden a few days pass and everything is fine, and then another 4 weeks of training, and then we need a deload. I don't know if you had similar observations.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I don't doubt there's not a study on this yet, but in your experience and what you see, or with the coaches that you talk to, then does this relationship change as experience and absolute loads, etc., go up? Because it's kind of generally accepted that, you know, when you're a 500-pound squatter, squatting 500, is hard, but it's not as stressful as squatting 900 when you're a 900-pound squatter. So how do you see that playing into the programming of individuals as they become better and they start performing at a higher level?
So yeah, I would probably hedge my bets on deloads being needed more frequently for somebody of that caliber, because they are either the number one powerlifter in the world, or like a very muscular, strong individual, potentially on PDs, potentially being able to cause a lot of damage with those sessions. So I'd probably assume that, okay, they need more frequent deloads, but then again, I wouldn't make an assumption and then stick to that assumption, even though the training data we're collecting is going against it.
Sure.
So like, yeah, if I had somebody who was 300 pounds come work with me and they're squatting, 700, 800 pounds and they are super muscular, I'd probably go into it thinking, okay, let's be a bit more conservative. And it's likely that we'll need to take a step back more frequently than if you were to work with a beginner or an intermediate lifter who squats 400. But then if I'm seeing that person doing well and feeling good and the feedback is like, yep, all good, sessions are going great, performance is going up, there's no reason to prophylactically pull a stop just because I made that assumption.
Sure. One last question, I'm sorry. And this may be a study that you do at some point, which would be cool. With minimal effective dose for strength, do you perceive or believe that probably changes throughout a powerlifter's career? For example, again, if we go with that 900-pound squatter, they probably can't do the volume anyway that the 500-pound squatter, 5x5 at 80%, whatever. The 900-pound squatter probably can't do that full stop, and yet they will be able to progress even though they have a limiting factor on the volume they can handle at certain percentages. So do you think there's something at play there where minimal effective dose at certain percentages will adapt and change as someone gets to a higher level of performance?
Yeah, probably. That would be really cool to see, if you feel like making everybody here for a year, follow different protocols. But that's where, again, I love to incorporate some form of training, like single or something in training that can give us pretty quick feedback on how things are going, and be able to see that, oh, okay, he's single at RP6, predicts this E1RM. Oh, they're stuck on the same E1RM for a while the rest of their training is pretty low volume. This doesn't look like it's very effective. But then the issue is that based on how slow strength increases are over time after you've been lifting for years and years, then it's very difficult to really know whether, the response they're getting from training is not good enough versus, okay, they've just naturally plateaued and I will take time. But that's where I would be happy to okay, let's push volume a tiny bit above minimum effective dose, because I'd rather make that bet and not waste a ton of time waiting to see, okay, are they going to make gains now? Is it just them slowing down, or is the volume not effective anymore? Especially if their feedback is super easy training, I'm fully recovered, session RP is low.
So it's just I suppose also in that scenario, doing too much will give you an indicator sooner, because if they're only going to gain 1% a year, the time it's going to take you to discern whether they've gained 1% is going to be a year. Whereas I suppose if the volume goes up too much and they start to regress, you'll probably know that sooner. Like you'd get that feedback. So at least there's a self-correcting mechanism that doesn't smack you in the face in 12 months time. It's going to be 3 weeks or 4
Well,
weeks.
I think there's other variables at play too when you're talking about the lifters that are at that high end. Is they may not necessarily have to get stronger from year 1 to year 2, because their ability to display strength was compromised because they went into the meet too beat up, right? Like at a certain point in time, and I've kind of always said this with any top power lifter, is whatever they display on the platform typically is not their maximal absolute strength, right? Because very rarely do you see a third attempt that's a grinder and you can't put 5 more pounds on, right? Usually there's either something left or they fell out of the groove or whatever it's going to be. So in a lot of cases, if they could just go into the next meet a year later with the same strength that they had, but be able to display it better because now they're not fucked up or as fucked up, because everybody's going to get fucked up as they go through the training going into that it becomes the minimal effective training will actually change to some degree, because the ultimate goal would be we just need to maintain your strength but going healthier next time, which could be, the cardio or, just not doing stupid shit to overreach to try to get a 1%, which is training harder than what they really need to train, because at that point now they're compromised from what they could actually display. Because at that level, the healthier person generally wins, given the total is with 100 pounds plus or minus, because the strongest can go in but be beat up and then not be able to display strength as effectively. So it becomes a little bit different chess game when you're dealing with that level. Right, because they can push really hard to gain that 1%, but they may not need it because they've never displayed over fucking 90% of what they have in the first place.
So
So
like the risk associated with the extra training that it would take to get the 1% probably isn't worth the chance that they come to the meet 10% more people.
Yeah. I remember a conversation with Louis after one of the meets that I did. I smoked an 860 squat or whatever it was. And I'm like, okay, we need to change this. We need to add this to whatever the waves are and all this other shit. And he just stopped me and said, no, all we have to do is basically the same shit you just did, but actually do the 900 that you should have done today.
Nice.
And it resonated with me like, oh, wait a minute. This makes sense, because if I can go in and not have a fucked up pack and my hip being all jacked up and all this other stuff, then maybe because I could have done the 9, but what if I was even healthier? Maybe it would be more than what that was. And it was a perspective shift, but we're talking about outliers again, right? That are at that top end, where all those other variables will probably matter more than the actual training, because they should have that figured out. I mean, at that point, sleep, nutrition, recovery, PEDs, all those things are going to have a more significant role on being able to get them to recover between training bouts.
So I mean, we see that all levels to some point, right? Like we all know people who are like in a meet, and let's say they're 6 weeks out, but their elbow tendonitis is horrendous. They'll still have the mindset of, I have to do my 5 sets of low bar squat, otherwise I'm not going to get X on the platform. When in reality, it's like, well, is that the benefit you're going to get from those 5 sets specifically of low bar squat? Are they really giving you more than what another week of elbow tendonitis is going to, it's still kind of relevant, right? Like everything's got a risk, a reward, or cost. And I suppose, at those points, they just get so stuck on, I have to do X, otherwise I won't make progress. When to kind of circle back to what this whole thing has kind of been about, the amount you need to do to make some progress is probably way less than you think.
Yes.
And the incremental increase you get from doing progressively more is also probably less than you think. So is it really worth beating yourself up for?
Yeah, and it's a bigger cost the better you get. Which comes back to that minimal effective training stimulus.
Trademark.
Right? That's where it comes back through. We've been going for a long time. So what is the best way for people to get a hold of you?
I guess YouTube, Dr. Pak, Instagram, Dr. Pak. That's it. Or outside in Southampton.
Outside in Southampton? Yes.
It's a small city.
Yeah. Any final thoughts that you have?
Thank you so much for having me. Absolute honor. Been a follower of Elite FTS for a while. And yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you for coming out. Tom, again, thanks for the assist. And we're done. All right, guys, thanks for watching the video to the end. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and click here, 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 or here for more videos.